lines.
Live from the divided states of America, it is time now for the show that brings you more sides of all the issues that really matter in the politically independent corner. I am investigative radio show host Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Together, our voices, our faces, our words, we constitute Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. All right, with that strange introduction out of the way, getting into the headlines now. Then we'll be back over talking with Jamarl. He'll be giving a monologue on the Portland stuff going on. We'll be back talking about that in a few minutes. Then we're taking calls at 7:15 Eastern or 4:15 Pacific. But first, the headlines. Georgia Governor Brian Kemp issued an executive order Wednesday banning more than a dozen local governments in his state from mandating masks be worn in public. This came as numbers of infections and deaths continued to escalate, with 84% of the hospitals already occupied. Georgia Governor Kemp also issued that executive order after Mayor of Atlanta, Keisha Lance Bottoms, mandated through her own executive order that businesses must on the positive side, he does encourage people to wear masks. He's just not going to ensure they do so. Our second story, Israel is drafting a secret list of intelligence officials that could be arrested if they travel abroad and prosecuted for war crimes if the International Criminal Court at The Hague chooses to open an investigation into Israel and Hamas for war crimes. There are about 200 to 300 names on that list, including none other than current Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Gantz, co-prime minister. This is directly from CNBC. Many of Joe Biden's bundlers told CNBC that the renewed effort by these business leaders is linked to the fact that Senator Bernie Sanders and more liberal candidates are no longer a threat to becoming president. Donors to the Biden committees included James Murdoch, Steven Spielberg, and Merck CEO Ken Frazier. The big money donors are capitalists. That's a quote. The big money donors are capitalists. For a minute, Bernie was close to locking it up, but then came South Carolina. They were petrified of Trump and horrified by Bernie. Now they actually have a choice. Before they didn't. End quote. That comes from Florida businessman and Biden bundler John Morgan. In our next story, and this is a big one, intelligence officials in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada have accused Russia of trying to steal vaccines by hacking. Russia has denied this. Specifically, the three Western countries are claiming that Cozy Bear / APT-29, that's Advanced Persistent Threat 29, is responsible for the attack. This is the same method that CrowdStrike had claimed was used. They associated this method with the actions of a Russian group used in the DNC hack. Again, this was back in 2016, mid-2016, but this is really what inaugurated the Russiagate story, and they're falling back on the same method. We can talk more about this later, more on that story definitely, but that's the headline. In our next headline, yesterday morning, it was reported that another 1.3 million people had filed first-time jobless claims on a seasonally adjusted basis. That was for the week ending July 11th. That's down 10,000 from the prior week's revised level, but when on an unadjusted basis, when you don't take into account sort of seasonal fluctuations, largely having to do with kids going to summer school and other seasonal occupations, more than 1.5 million people filed first-time claims, and that's up almost 109,000 from the week before. In our next story, the British government yesterday accused, quote, unquote, Russian actors of trying to meddle in the country's elections. The statement came from Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab. That is the same individual who recently advanced the UK Magnitsky Act to file new sanctions on officials in Russia, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, and North Korea. He said he was, quote, almost uncertain, end quote, that unnamed individuals, quote, sought to interfere, end quote, in the December 2019 election by amplifying online, quote, illicitly acquired and leaked government documents, end quote. Those documents were used by the then leader of the main opposition Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, to back up his claims that the Conservative government was preparing to, quote, sell off, end quote, the National Health Service. The Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, called Raab's statements, quote, vague and contradictory, end quote, and she called on the UK to produce facts. In our next story, a two-day summit in the European Union is expected by many of its more prominent attendees to show slow progress on reaching agreements to respond to COVID-19 and the widespread economic contraction many countries in the EU face. German Chancellor Angela Merkel says she expects, quote, very, very difficult negotiations, end quote. More on that later, though. 2 days again. 15 women have accused staffers for the Washington Redskins of sexual harassment and verbal abuse. We talked about this story briefly yesterday at 9:30. We're coming back to it today with the actual story out. Some of the staffers are reportedly within Redskin owner Dan Snyder's inner ring. This follows the move by the team earlier this week to officially retire the Redskins name and logo. And that team, by the way, has not revealed the less offensive replacement for the Redskins name and logo. That is still forthcoming. We'll see where that goes with all of this other stuff going on with these sexual abuse and harassment allegations coming out. In our next story, Florida has hit over 150 deaths in a day. That's 14,000 new cases. Texas has more than 10,000 new cases. And the United States as a whole has seen more than 77,000 confirmed new cases. That's more than 10,000 new cases than the day before. And we're pretty steadily approaching Fauci's warning of 100,000 new cases per day as a sort of grim, very grim milestone. Brazil, on the other hand, has hit more than 2 million total coronavirus cases, and India has passed the 1 million infected mark. In our next story, a change in Russia's constitution bans same-sex marriage and adoption. That actually came earlier this month. On this recently, we'll be talking more about this later. But this is interesting. This is, as far as I can tell, a little bit noteworthy. But it's sort of setting into stone a lot of Russian attitudes on these things. I don't know that it changed anything. I don't know that it sort of, in other words, it changed the Constitution, but I don't know that by including this in the Constitution, any pre-existing laws were suddenly violated or would have to significantly change their form. I'm not sure about that. We'll have more on that later, but it's interesting to see this coming out as it has in the past couple of days as a part of this sort of, as far as I can tell, wave of anti-Russian commentary and media. And with those headlines, you're all caught up. That's the news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, Jamarl, what is your top priority today?
So originally, the top priority was going to be an interview by the indomitable Angela Davis on her support for voting for Biden over Trump, and how Blue No Matter Who has basically created this discrediting of our political system, or you could say ineffectiveness of our political system to deal with the real material needs of the population itself. But this story is more appalling, if I'm being honest. The Blue No Matter Who stuff is going to be there tomorrow. The Portland, Oregon stuff is immediate, and it's taking place right now. So the protests in Portland, Oregon have been going on for the last 59 days, ever since basically in the wake of George Floyd being killed. Now, Oregon Live is reporting federal officers responded to one late-night demonstration downtown using tear gas, smoke, munitions to press protesters away from two federal buildings. The confrontation between federal officers and protesters came hours after Interim Department of Homeland Security Secretary Chad Wolf arrived in Portland to meet with federal law enforcement officials. Let's add some more to that. This is opb.org. And you can't see the pictures of this on the radio, but it looks like a war zone. It looks like if you were in one of the countries that we've invaded, and you have men in camo with weapons and lasers shooting in the middle of smoke and fire with people running and screaming. That's what it looks like. This wasn't necessarily something that needed to be this way. People do have First Amendment rights, but nevertheless, here we are. opb.org. Federal law enforcement officers have been using unmarked vehicles to drive around downtown Portland to detain protesters since at least July 14th. Personal accounts and multiple videos posted online show the officers driving up to people, detaining individuals with no explanation of why they were arrested, and driving off. Officers from the U.S. Marshal Special Operations Group and Customs and Border Protections, BORTAC, have been sent to Portland to protect federal buildings during the recent protests against racism and police brutality. But interviews conducted by OPB show officers are also detaining people on Portland streets who aren't near federal buildings or federal property, nor is it clear that the people that are being arrested have engaged in any criminal activity at all. And much of the excuse that they use are basically vague references to Antifa with vandalism, saying that there was violence against buildings. Look, either your police force can do the job or not. And if it can't, that's a whole different conversation that we need to be having. But fact of the matter is, people do have or supposed to, have First Amendment rights, their ability to go out and protest their grievances. And if this is one of their grievances, and that grievance is not necessarily being seen to, these people have a philosophical, not just right, but responsibility to do so. That's what they're doing. They're doing God's work. Now, I'm not saying I like everything that may take place in that situation. I don't like violence against any person per se, so don't misunderstand me. But you have a police force that is basically unmarked and unnamed. Meaning, if I'm engaging a policeman, there's certain rights that I'm supposed to have in that process. I should be able to protest peacefully. I should be able to stand outside and know who that person is. I should be able to get some kind of recognition for why I am being detained or I am being arrested. And what was taking place in Portland would be guys driving up in unmarked cars, jumping out, burlap sacking, dragging people in and driving them away. In which case, one guy explained it was a multitude of walls until I found myself in a federal building. But again, some of these people are not even near federal buildings. And if these are indeed federal officers, then their responsibilities need to be kept to federal buildings. The mayor, not to mention the governor, has basically said these people need to leave. These officers need to leave. They're basically making the situation worse. Senator Jeff Merkley made the point that this is more of something that takes place in an authoritarian state where you have unmarked agents of the state basically burlap sacking the citizens and taking them to black sites. This is horrendous. Please tell me you understand that this is problematic. Even if you're a right-winger, please tell me you understand this is problematic. For right-wingers who scream about the overreach of the government, what is this? It's one thing if you say cops are going to be out there holding the line against the protesters. It's another thing if you're going to say unmarked people, unaccountable, because again, they're unmarked. You have no idea who these people are. And in one case, they apparently shot a protester in the face, injuring that particular individual. This is unconscionable. And this is not something that we can allow. It's bad enough we allow a militarized police force. It's bad enough we allow cops, named cops, by the way, to kill 1,000 people a year with 99% going unaccountable in regards to any kind of charges. It is bad enough that 1,000 a year has a skew going in a particular direction. It is bad enough that we have 25% of the world's population in our prison with 4% of the world's population. Those things are horrific in and of themselves. And on top of that, when the public is protesting real grievances, this is not, nothing stuff. This is stuff that this country has dragged along for decades. And being added upon by all of the pressures associated with the illness, with people being stuck at home, with people losing their jobs, with people being evicted out of their office. You don't think there's consternation in the nation and you don't think that that's legitimate? No, it is. And a testament to that is the quick shift in point of view of the American public in a very short period of time. Your government needs to address the grievances of the population. And your government has decided not to do that. To instead, to send in basically a Gestapo force to basically do the job of dealing with the actual real concerns. This is white, black, gay, straight, everything in between that is out on those streets. This is not the way to handle it. Shane, what do you think about this? Is the way to deal with a crowd asserting their First Amendment rights to protests by sending in unnamed goons to basically randomly grab people off the street to intimidate the others?
I mean, if this is happening like I'm hearing it, like you're saying it, like I've been reading about it, I don't like that at all. I don't think anybody should or really would. I think a lot of the people who are supporting this are probably supporting it because they don't think that's exactly what's happening. And or they've also seen some of the footage coming out of Portland, including the rioting stuff, and they might think that something approaching this is justified. That's more complicated. I don't think it is. You were talking about peaceful protests and like the sort of core of the protest being peaceful. That may be true, but it's not most of what I'm seeing in terms of the footage. And if there's no, I don't know, if there's no movement that's going to restrain the violent protesters or the rioters or whatever, which I've seen a lot of. I've seen people getting killed. Most of them most of the people who are getting injured seem to be getting injured by the other protesters. That's a little bit hard to sort of validate because a lot of the people who are injured by other protesters aren't necessarily wanting to go into the cops to report the crime. They're probably on the side of the protests, but this stuff is, I don't know, this stuff's complicated. I'm rambling a little bit there. We'll be back in just a minute taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. We'll also be talking about this, I'm sure. Until then, know that you're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Yo! So Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're taking calls this segment. 202-521-1320 is that number. If you want to call, again, that's 202-521-1320. There we go. Coming back to this conversation. I mean, again, if I'm reading this right, this is pretty remarkable and it's pretty sad. And in its own way, it could be seen as terrifying. The imposition of martial law, that kind of thing, that looming threat that a lot of Americans specifically fear, this looks a little bit like the beginnings of that. But on the other hand, and there's always another hand, it's just complicated when they come together. On the other hand, we've been seeing rioting for months, as far as I can tell, sort of intermittently. And at first it was pretty widespread, and since then it's been restricted to a few cities, as far as I can tell, Portland probably being one of the most notable of them. As somebody who doesn't have any powers that the police has, as somebody who's not in a position of authority, all that I can do is speak to people who have somewhere near my level of power, who are basically doing these protests, which I agree with a lot in sort of spirit. But if you're not going to restrain people from acting violently, what you're going to do is legitimate the use of extreme force by the government, because it's just this dynamic. The pendulum swings, things get further out of control, tension gets ratcheted up. Ideally, the police would be restrained in their use of force, but ideally the protesters would be too. And there's not an ethical parity between the two. Again, the police have far more funding by the government, as far as I can tell. They have far more power. They have the legitimate use of weapons. That's a pretty damn big thing. So it's not like there's any parity here. But again, all I can talk to, the only people I can effectively convince, I think, are a few people maybe in the protests. And I'm just recommending caution, clear organization, and attempts to minimize violence and to try to keep that stuff from happening. Anyway, that was my spiel. What's your take, Jamarl?
Now, I do agree with you about the violence part. I am not a big fan of injuring people during these protests. I think it's counterproductive. The government basically is a sovereign force. The public typically will remain with you until the point where violence comes in which case they care more about order as opposed to, whatever you're trying to change at that point. Meaning, when Martin Luther King was doing his protests, he was using people in suits or people doing sit-ins for a reason. The whole point is we're being non-violent and they are attacking us. It's a provocation of the state, but it's a provocation of the state in a way where it's very clear that you haven't done anything wrong in that process. In this case, I agree with you. This gets murkier. There are some of these cases where, things are being basically destroyed. I don't necessarily think things being destroyed is violence. But I would say, though, that becomes somewhat of an issue for people in that particular community. So fair enough. That being said, that's a cop job, right? I mean, is that really the job for masked agents of the government? Police have all sorts of wide-ranging powers. including in that is the ability to beat, to kick, to punch, to drag you away, the dispensation of force, almost, unanimously the dispensation of force. So do you really need this kind of extra power of being anonymous? And is that something that a democratic system should have? Meaning those people protesting out there have every right, I would even say philosophically so, to be out there and protest their grievances, especially if it's something that is not being attended to with everything else that's going on in the country now. It would be weird if there weren't protests. But I think your point is, look, you don't like the violence, and fair enough. But I could make a counterpoint of saying, look, those people are representing what they've experienced. Like, do you think that violence comes out in a society that wasn't as, let's say, unequal or wasn't as difficult as the society is, especially with the guns and everything else that goes around? And even our point of view in regards to this kind of John Wayne concept of right and wrong in regards to the dispensation of force.
I mean, from my perspective, and real quick, because we've got a caller, we've got Sarif, and I want to get to him. From my perspective, violence is usually not justified. There's this Hannah Arendt quote that I try to remember sometimes. I'd be paraphrasing, but basically, violence is always a difficult thing to use. Violence is always a difficult thing to understand, frankly. And part of why it's difficult to use violence is the further away you are from an event that you're trying to influence with the use of force, with the use of violence, the less legitimate it is. I don't really see what this violence is creating.
Don't misunderstand. Wait. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not using the argument of justified. I'm asking something else. I'm asking you more so, sit above it for a moment and take out right, wrong, good, bad, take out all that stuff. And just look at it as cause and effect, action, consequence, and the way that one thing precipitates another. Does it make sense based on what you know of the way this country is propagated over the course of its history, that this erupts in this way, where there's going to be elements of violence? Even though a lot of the protests are peaceful, there will be spots of violence.
Yeah, I can make sense of it, and I understand why people are doing it, but that doesn't give justification. And as somebody who's like engaged with that political process, there are all sorts of terrible things that happen to people that they have to respond to. And that's true on an individual level. It's also true on the social level. And I think that what we as a country would do well for ourselves to attain is some level of maturity when it comes to dealing with our problems. Now, that maturity is going to look a little bit like political discipline, where you organize around specific issues, you create these platforms, you make sure that they're damn well independent from establishment influences. Again, I've seen hundreds of millions of dollars pouring from big players, from like the Ford Foundation, George Soros, et al., et cetera, into the Black Lives Matter organizations. It seems like that's co-optation, right? I mean, that's financial co-optation. That's what that's going to turn into.
But Shane, I'm asking you something different though, and you're going in a different point. Whether it's justified or not is irrelevant. Justification is subjective. Justification is not an absolute. Whether it's justified is irrelevant to whether it's justified or not is irrelevant to the point of whether or not it's understandable that it happens. I'm making the point that the fact that you could say, yes, based on events in the country and the way the country is propagated, it is absolutely foreseeable that there will be eruptions from the public at some point. Now, justification is the human element that's added onto it to try to say whether it's right or wrong, and those things becomes greatly subjective. I mean, you had people who set bombs who thought those bombs were perfectly subjective. I mean, who were perfectly rational. The U.S. goes around the world bombing people and killing people thinking it's perfectly rational. So, let's just be clear on what's subjective. I'm getting to something more bare bones of cause and effect. And if it is indeed a cause and effect outcome, it's like I can't wring my hands over something that becomes almost like a mechanical process. I agree with you. Well, I would prefer it to be organized, and I would prefer it to not be violent, and I would prefer it to be politically pointed. But life is messy. I mean, it's not that I love it.
Well, but here's the thing. I mean, technically everything that happens for a reason, and so mechanically, cause and effect, from an almost Buddhist sense or something, a spiritual sense, you should try to accept things as they are. And in that sense, it's very clear this is a reaction to many things. But it's clear that this is a reaction. And like from the beginning of my last answer, I said, this is understandable. I understand this. But what I'm doing is explicitly moving into sort of subjective value territory, because as a part of this political process, I think that's where we need to be. If we're only responding to people by saying, well, this is inevitable, this is legitimate, whatever the case may be, however we want to frame it. Again, legitimate is more subjective, inevitable is more objective. if I think what we need to do to like constructively influence it, once we've recognized the facts, is move into value claims and move into having these conversations about what's actually right. Because again, that's what's going to help to sort of organize these narratives that make sense of what's going on for both the people who are protesting and the people who are being protested. And once we come up with those narratives, once there's more organization, both mental, conceptual, and physical, political organization, I think we're going to be in a much better standing for actually moving forward with this stuff. That might be naive or idealistic or something. What's your take, Jamarl?
No, don't call it naive. I mean, look, I can't say I disagree with you. It's just I don't have the belief that right exists. I don't think there's no such thing as right. Right becomes extremely subjective, and it becomes one of those things that's something that you almost have to convince people of. Now, if we can use right in that sense to try to give it, let's say, more boundaries around it, and basically try to make the argument to people that, look, you can get what you want, but it does take organization, and it does take a certain amount of forbearance and energy, even though it may be understood, it may not necessarily be expended in the best ways. So I get where you're coming from on this. So I don't want to come across as if I'm entirely disagreeing with you on it. And I don't even want to come across as that point of view is naive. I mean, after all, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, all movements at some point had to have some organization of energy associated with it in order to take energy that might have been expended in, let's say, to the sides, to actually put it out the back so it can kind of go forward. So no, I don't think it's naive or anything else. I don't know. I guess I look at this stuff almost as mechanical processes working itself out. And it's like I wring my hands over it sometimes. I get annoyed at it sometimes. But I do want to influence more than anything else. And so I do understand that level of influence has to somehow deal with organization. So I don't disagree with you entirely on this. But we do
this
have
is going to be, let's go.
Go ahead.
Exactly, Tarif. Let's go to Tarif.
Yeah, Tarif from New Orleans. What's going on, Tarif?
Good morning, gentlemen. I thought I never was going to get in. But anyway, I have 3 comments. The first comment, please, people, do not forget about Julian Assange. He's still in prison. He still need our help. He needs to be freed. Second comment, Truth Free Media, The Minds of Men. Y'all need to check that out. Check that out on YouTube. My third comment is dealing with Sean Woosley, a combat veteran that served in Iraq. He had a medical marijuana card. It was legal in Arizona, but it wasn't legal in Alabama. Him and his wife was passing through it. They got stopped at a gas station, and before you know it, they got arrested. And he's looking to serve 5 years. And it stems back from what Jim and Doris said. It stems back from the 1994 crime bill to give people longer sentences dealing with drugs and whatnot. Because Alabama don't have, it's not legal. Excuse me, they don't have a medical marijuana legislation. It's not legal there. That this dude this combat veteran could be facing 5 years, and he got PTSD. He got back injury, shoulder injury, and he was getting homeless shelter from the VA housing from the VA, and because he got a federal conviction now, that they took that away from him. Him and his wife was living homeless. She lost her jobs and everything. So his name is Sean Woosley, and I'm pretty sure they have other cases like him. These laws need to be changed, man. These innocent people, they're not criminals throughout the land, need to be freed, and we need to legalize marijuana for medication purposes, in all 50 states, and drop these charges on them and other people and let them free, and so we can come up with solutions. That's all I want to say.
Thank you, Tarif.
Thank you for that, Tarif. Yeah, I agreed on that.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I mean, even if he wasn't a combat veteran, look, we're putting people in cages for smoking a plant. And as ridiculous as that is literally what is taking place. Those laws needs to be expunged. Those laws were created under Nixon in order to lock up blacks and hippies. I know I say that, but it's true. Ehrlichman himself had basically attested to the same thing, and those laws have basically been expanded and made that much worse by people like Joe Biden. So yeah, this is a travesty of justice, to put it mildly. But we'll be back. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Stay tuned.
Fault lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? If you're tired of a superficial and shallow reporting for the mainstream media, here's your alternative. Forget the spoon-fed sound bites from pundits who know so little about so much. We deal with real issues. War in the Middle East, the military-industrial complex, U.S.-Russian relations, the rise of China, austerity, mass migration, global warming, and social justice movements in the United States and around the world, and much more. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardroom of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for chance speak and are heard loud and clear 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. A quick programming note before we move to Joel Siegel. If you want to listen to us on the air, you can. In the DC area, we're on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. If, on the other hand, you're in Kansas City, out in the center of the states, you can listen to us on 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM, also 1140 AM. If, on the other hand, you're either in the States or elsewhere in the world, you can listen to us online, Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music. We're also on YouTube. You can do a quick search for Jamarl Thomas and Fault Lines Radio. You'll see each of those channels pop up, each with their own live video feed. We're also over on Twitter on Periscope. Go to twitter.com/faultlinesradio, and you can check us out on the live Periscope right up top there. With that out of the way, we're very happy to be joined now by Joel Siegel. Joel Siegel is a former congressional staffer, co-author of H.R. 676. That's the expanded and improved Medicare for All bill. He's also one of the leading architects for the passage of the Affordable Care Act, a.k.a. Obamacare. He is also co-founder and national director of the Justice Action Mobilization Network, JAM, a nationwide multiracial climate action network. Joel, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing fantastic. Just bought 2 new electric basses, a Music Man Stingray, and a Fender Jazz preamp bass, because I'm doing a new CD, so I'm very, very happy, like a kid who got Christmas toys.
Oh man, that sounds beautiful. You were during COVID-19. You're out in California, right?
No, I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina. That's where I was raised. I moved here about 7 years ago from the city I love called Washington, D.C.
Okay, there you go. Pardon me. Old news on my part. But I was just going to say, you're totally well set up for coronavirus.
What?
And with that, you know what? I think I'm going to pass it to you, Jamarl, actually. This is planning on talking first about this sort of Joe Biden fundraising thing with $100 million.
Oh, the bundlers.
Exactly.
So, Joe, welcome to the show, man. I always appreciate you coming on. Joe Biden has raised $100 million. Basically, the bundlers have come in to give Joe Biden cash. Now that Sanders has basically been pushed to the sidelines, and the assumption is that Joe Biden is going to win this race. You are working on the expansion of Medicare for All. Now, Medicare for All is basically my litmus test in regards to policy. And I'm always annoyed by the framing to which Joe Biden has asked questions around Medicare for All. So, for example, Joe Biden could, instead of saying, hey, Joe Biden, 88% of Democrats back Medicare for All, 70% of everyone else supports Medicare for All. If Donald Trump really is the apocalypse and he's going to kick puppies in the way that you say he's going to kick puppies and eat babies, then how do you justify not supporting a policy that has this much support in order to coalesce the party organically to win this race? Now, no one asked the question that way. Why? Why is the question never asked that way, considering that this policy has so much more broad support?
That's a great question. Once the Affordable Care Act was passed, I used to joke with my family and my friends, and I would say, well, I guess I'll see Medicare for All when I'm 90 years old. I had no idea that it would become a litmus test for the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. I was hoping and our movement was something that would happen. I'll just tell you what I think's up with Joe Biden. I don't know Joe Biden. I do know most members of Congress and Nancy Pelosi. And here's what I think Biden's strategy was. In order to win the nomination, he had to move to the right of Bernie. The best way for him to do that was to distance himself from Medicare for all and say, well, I'm for a public option. And the real challenge, I think, with the Medicare for all movement that John Connors and I really built for 13 years by traveling to about 400 different cities and holding congressional briefings and hearings, is that the movement has to be professionalized, fully staffed, and fully funded so that it screams to Joe Biden and the Democrat Party, this is what we want, as much as we scream about Black Lives Matter or climate change. And that's one really big challenge that impacts anyone running for Congress is lack of visibility. And so statistics don't really do it. Number two, there's a lot of donors. It's what I call the donor class of the Democratic Party. There's two classes in the Democratic Party. There's your donor base and your grassroots base. The grassroots base is now majority Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Obama, more Bernie. And the donors, I've been in actual fundraisers where liberal, usually white dudes would say, okay, Siegel, I'm for Medicare for all, but I don't want the Democratic Party to take away my health care, my private insurance. And I would say, well, what if everyone had what you had? And they would sort of stop and get red-faced and a little bit embarrassed. But I think that's really the tension that Biden really believes, and the Democratic Party, that they can win independent swing voters and win the nomination if they say they're against Medicare for all. And it's up to the movement to demand it, diselect people who don't support Medicare for all. And I know I can't curse on your show, right? That's against the law, but
you can. Right.
I check this out, man. On the Congressional Blue Cross Blue Shield plan, I call it Blue Cross Blue Steel because it steals my money. I owe $40,000 right now in co-pays, and I've spent $60,000 out of pocket in the last 12 years. So it sucks. So anytime you have private health insurance, you're going to get ripped off because it's an evil system. It's neo-slavery. It sucks. And there needs to be, and I'll close with this, there has to be some kind of a high-level poll that's taken by an independent pollster of people with private health insurance who don't like it. Because when they do the polling, they don't, the questions, the way that I've seen the polls myself, and they don't really get to that matter. And then we don't hear people on television or in the news. I wrote the movie Sicko with Michael Moore. I don't know if you both remember that movie, Sicko.
Yes, I do. It's a great film.
Congress. Yeah. Well, thank you. Michael Moore's a genius, man. It's one thing to bring an idea to him. It's another thing for him to actually did this genius movie, And I was trying to show the Congress and the American people that there were millions of people like me who were just oppressed and had a big foot on our neck in terms of getting health care. And I think we're pretty successful with that movie. We need to do an updated movie that's with people who have health insurance. And, the bankruptcies, like my mother bankrupt because of my medical bills. They just took, one hospital just took $1,800 out of my checking account because my insurance company wouldn't cover my CPAP machine. And I'm sorry that I was so loquacious, but I was hoping that'll be helpful.
No, that's all very true and interesting. Yeah. I mean, real quick on that, and then you can take it, Jamarl. We were talking with Dr. Bill Honigman yesterday about Medicare for all. What I was saying was this idea, pushing. Yes, he is very kind and good. But we were talking about this, and I was saying, I think it would make sense to take the pharmaceutical and the current insurance industries down a notch or two, sort of do institutional reform, a bit of excavation on what's gone wrong, and then pare them down slightly before you implement some kind of broader Medicare program, because otherwise you're going to get these entrenched interests who are trying to take over and prematurely co-opt any progress you can make. I was worried about, when I was looking at the ACA, I was worried about some of the influence that insurance companies had on that. It sounds like you're sort of arguing for something relatively similar. Maybe from a media push, we're talking about the polling, the problems that people have with their private insurance, and you're also talking at the end there with Michael Moore about potentially a movie on that subject. I think that's a good way to do that. I think that's sort of addressing current problems in the system, bringing a little bit more light to them, and then that becomes part of the discourse. That becomes part of the conversation. We've learned some lessons from that, ideally, and then once we've learned those lessons, then we can go in sort of with more information, construct a broad medical platform. Whether it's Medicare for All or something else is a little bit different, but at least we would have learned more from that process. That's my take.
I think that's right. I mean, I'll give you a three-step process. If I was still working in Congress, here's the one thing that I think we have to do. In Switzerland, they have private health insurance companies, but they're nonprofit. I think you have to radically transform private insurance so that it resembles the Blue Cross. Well, they had Blue Cross Blue Shield back in the late 50s and early 60s that paid about 90% of the bill. But when Medicare was introduced, hospitals started charging a lot of money, knowing they could make a lot of money off seniors and the disabled. Then the private insurance rates skyrocketed. But they should all be forced to be nonprofit. But, if the federal government regulates commerce, and it regulates, airplanes, and it regulates the Coast Guard, and why can't it regulate private insurance, which is a frickin' ripoff? That's number one. Number two, they really should come up with right now a Medicare for All single-payer plan, and just like 676 or Jayapal's, a wonderful improvement on that bill. And then I think you have to play political jiu-jitsu when you're working in Congress and you're trying to sell something to the public. What I would do as a first step is just say, if you want to keep your horrible private health insurance, hey, man, go right ahead. But if you want, single payer Medicare for all, where there's no co-pays or deductibles, just go ahead and create that system. And eventually the people who have sucked private health insurance would go to the public system. That's how they do it in Europe. But thirdly, and lastly, more importantly, unless there's a movement for single payer, like with the budget of Sierra Club, like $70, $80 million, we're not going to go much further on single payer. I mean, how serious can the single payer movement be if it doesn't have a full-time office in Washington, D.C. or Chicago or New York? You have to do town hall meetings. You have to demystify the myth of single payer. I've tried to do this for years, but the single payer movement in its recalcitrance just will not go to that level. I'm a revolutionary, okay? If you're a revolutionary, and Reagan said he was a revolutionary, so I'm a progressive Democratic revolutionary for single payer. You have to take it to that level and organize to the point where you're roaring, not whispering single payer. I'm very proud of the movement because it's done an amazing job, but for it to win, it's going to have to go to the next level. There has to be a single payer PAC where you pay members of Congress, you get them donations if they run on it. There is no other system, by the way. This private system is going to bankrupt pension funds on the state level. It's going to bankrupt this nation. It's already bankrupting us. We got to throw it away and start over. But, I'm hopeful that with COVID-19, with 40 million people about to lose their health insurance, well, right now it's 3.5 million in the last month. It's about 38 million will lose it in the next few months. I think there is going to be definitely a move to a public option. But even when I was in Congress, we couldn't even get traction on a Medicare public option. I mean, that never was passed as part of Obamacare. So even that's going to be hard,
Okay, we're going to come back in a moment. We have Joel Siegel with us, former congressional staffer, co-author of H.R. 676, the Expanded and Improved Medicare for All bill, and one of the leading architects for passage of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. We'll be back in a moment. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and digs straight into the details. Set your clock to the critical hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. You guys are listening to Thomas and Stranahan. We have with us Joel Siegel, former congressional staffer, co-author of H.R. 676, the Expanded and Improved Medicare for All bill, and one of the leading architects for the passage of the Affordable Care Act. Joel, so going into the healthcare thing, for myself, I had to, going back to when I was 17, had to deal with kidney failure. Now, for a parent that barely made $18,000 a year, if she made that much, that is debilitating. And it's one of those bills where even if you have health insurance, you're getting hit with bills over and over again, specialists, pills, surgeries, and this goes on for the course of like decades. And so and then if you are working and then you lose your job, you have this thing of COBRA that you're supposed to somehow be able to afford when you're not getting a paycheck. This is even that much more debilitating when you're around 17, you hit this weird donut hole where you're not working anywhere and yet you need to somehow provide for your health insurance. So I agree with you on this. And with so many people losing their health insurance, I think my thing is you had a 9-point jump in people who were on board for Medicare for All during the COVID-19 crisis for obvious reasons. And that number is probably going to go up that much higher. And the sad fact of the matter is, though, that because Trump is doing so horribly and he's just so grotesque and he has been so bad on all of these main emergencies that have availed us, Joe Biden basically has a tin ear. He understands that the majority of the people that are voting for him are doing so to keep Trump out of that office. And under that scenario, there is no power to move Joe Biden on those issues. Am I wrong in this? Meaning the only way to ever get Joe Biden to ever even conceive of adopting a policy like Medicare for All would be for him to be threatened with loss. And even then, he may not do it. But at the very least, the potential for him to lose is the only force, I think, that people really have at their disposal in trying to get some kind of policy adjustment or some kind of policy adopted by a person who is against it. Am I wrong in that? And am I wrong in even in my assessment that Trump is doing so uniquely horribly that Joe Biden doesn't necessarily have to listen to anyone?
Well, first of all, one thing I feel is your passion. I'm sorry about what you went through as a young man. I went through the same thing, by the way, with sleep apnea, and almost died 3 times from it. Was denied care. I had to move to Atlanta in order to get care. I used to lie and say I was a millionaire, and I was a liar. I lied and I deceived doctors and hospitals because I had to, or else I couldn't get. I used to tell them I was a millionaire. I didn't need health insurance, which was a big lie. I was a serial liar, but I got health care. I have a different perspective, and I'll tell you what it is. My training was from Martin Luther King's disciples, Walter Fauntleroy, John Conyers, John Lewis. That's who really taught me politics. And what the civil rights movement did back in the 60s is they told LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, we will support you and we will elect you president, but you're going to have to do 2 things. You're going to have to introduce and pass civil rights laws, and then you're going to have to pass a great society. What we'd have to do, and I tell you, I was the architect of, I have a lot of freedom now to be kind of honest about what I did with Mr. Conyers, because I had to really keep it very quiet for, when you're working in Congress, you can't talk about these things. What I did was I went to Dennis Kucinich. I asked him to co-author with Mr. Conyers the H.R. 676 Medicare for All bill. I remember my chief of staff didn't want it to happen. I didn't give it to him. I went ahead and did it anyway and got Dr. Kucinich because I knew he was going to run for president, hoping he'd run on single payer. And my dream was if he was running on single payer, he would shame Clinton, Edwards, and Obama into coming up with their own universal health care plan. And I remember Tim Russert from Meet the Press, who passed away during the debates on NBC, said, Dennis Kucinich, do you have a universal health care plan? Yes, I have single payer. And then he asked the other candidates, do you have a plan? No. Next debate, they all had a plan. That was my strategy. I just didn't think it would work. Similarly, I think what has to happen is you've got to get Biden elected first, even if you have to hold your nose, although he has put the most progressive, radical climate change policy I've ever seen in my life. By 2035, 100% clean, renewable energy and transportation, electric generation, and buildings. Like, holy Jesus, it's incredible. That's one reason when I'm going to vote for him, because he'll help save the planet. Trump will destroy it. And then you got to push him as hard as you can, the movement, and that includes the House and the Senate, to pass a single-payer bill. And let's say we get 8 years. So let's say in the first 4 years, let's say the first 100 days, the demand of our movement is going to be that you got to cover everybody either through Medicare or Medicaid. In other words, no uninsured people. There's about 85 million under or uninsured people, about 40 million right now who have no insurance. Cover everybody so they don't die. Step two, let's move to a universal single-payer system, but you can't do that with Trump and McConnell. It's a brick wall. You can do it just as Martin King was able to push LBJ in the Democratic Congress to civil rights. That's the theory of change that I adhere to. Does it take time? Yes. Can it be done? Absolutely. COVID-19 is presenting tragically an opportunity to go to Medicare for payer. But the biggest driver and the biggest reason why we'll have to go to single payer is because you're looking at, I think it'll be $16 trillion we'll be spending on healthcare in the next 10 to 15 years. It's going to bankrupt the state pension funds, the cost of corporate healthcare. And I think we'll move to single payer out of necessity so that we don't bankrupt businesses and bankrupt the pension funds.
Could you actually say a little bit more about that? I'm sorry for interrupting. Just real quick there. I'm trying to get my head around this. Why you mentioned $16 trillion? Why would it be cheaper to move to Medicare for all? Just briefly make the case for that, just so I can look into it a little bit more.
What if you study every single payer system? Taiwan is the best, by the way. You know what? The same people who helped me draft 676 were the ones who drafted the Taiwan single payer plan, which is the best universal healthcare system in the world. So if we want to really see what single payer would look like, it would be the Taiwan system, which is already in place. What single payer does is the government basically says, here is what we're going to spend on healthcare this year. So if you looked at it on, let's say, a graph, if you look at American healthcare expenditures, it always goes up every year. If you look at European single payer systems, you'll see the line is flat. The costs stay flat because it's nonprofit and you already know what you're going to spend. Whereas in our country, the hospitals basically have an open checkbook, and doctors and pharmaceutical companies. So there's no government referee to keep the costs from spiraling up and up and up and up and up. And single payer makes sure that you have global budgets for the hospitals. You know what the reimbursement rates are going to be for the doctors and how much assistive equipment's going to cost. And, that's why we even had a government in the first place, right, to be a referee between the public sector and the private sector. And that's why single payer is so effective. And you don't have any paperwork under 676. It's all electronic reimbursement. It's the paperwork. It's right around $300 billion a year you save just eliminating paperwork, bureaucracy, administration. The Republicans are always talking about, we don't like the government because they have too much bureaucracy. The insurance Byzantine bureaucracy is the most complicated, asinine bureaucracy that's ever been created by the human race. It doesn't make any sense. And single payer, that's why it saves money. It gets rid of all the paperwork. Electronic reimbursements. It's a nonprofit system. Yeah.
Joe, you said King wouldn't have backed LBJ, or King was backing LBJ under two conditions: that he passes the Great Society, and that he passes the civil rights legislation. But LBJ wasn't running again. And on top of LBJ deciding not to run again, King was willing to withdraw that support, especially for issues like the Vietnam War. those two issues represented basically a litmus test. If LBJ decided not to support those issues, would King have supported the Democratic Party?
Yeah, he would have. King, like John Connors was Martin Luther King's protege. So when Connors was running for office in Detroit, that's what Connors told me, Rosa Parks told King to come to Detroit. And I'm writing Connors' biography, by the way. I'm really excited about writing the greatest civil rights icon, greatest member of Congress, in my opinion, ever. He went down the wrong way. Then Connors won by 337 votes, I think, because of Martin King. And it was very clear that John Connors was to, be the representative of the civil rights movement. And the way Conyers operates and King and Fauntleroy and, all the great civil rights leaders is Republicans are always going to be against civil rights and economic justice. Democrats are going to be for it. You can move closer and closer to your goal if you elect a Democrat. Now, let's say Biden was not the nominee, right, and King was in power, then King, of course, would be backing, just like Jesse Jackson backed Sanders. Well, now Jesse Jackson is backing Biden, as is Elizabeth Warren, because they know with the Biden administration, you're going to expand health care, which with the Trump administration, they'll try to kill health care altogether because he's a sociopathic, a moron. And so, that's always been the logic of the civil rights movement. That would have been the logic of King. King's mantra was the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, and he would have gotten behind the Democratic nominee. And then King was a very, very radical revolutionary who, blocked streets and made sure that there was such, peacefully militant protest that he obstructed, society so that they did what the civil rights movement wanted. I think that's what you would see if King was alive. I mean, Mr. Connors and I organized press conferences all the time to get Sanjay Gupta out of office because he was against Medicare for all. And I got 4,000 doctors to draft a letter in the New York Times saying, we don't want you in the White House as Surgeon General, Sanjay Gupta. You might be eye candy, but you're against Medicare, man. So we pushed him out. And similarly, when Obama was going to cut Social Security, and I love Obama, by the way, but he was going to cut Social Security called change CPI by $50 a month. I organized a press conference in front of the Capitol with about 60 organizations and members of Congress, and we stopped him. So you have to do the same thing. When you're a progressive, whether it's Biden or whoever gets elected, you just got to keep pushing and pushing and pushing, but you're pushing against a brick wall and the imperial wizard of the KKK with Donald Trump. So Biden, of course, is the best way to go. And I'll close by saying, what happens when you don't have health insurance at all? You either die, stay sick, or go broke. The first step in a moral nation would be to cover everyone so they can at least get in to see a doctor or a hospital and not go through the hell that I went through my whole life. But then once you cover everybody, which of course would be, I think, very possible under a Biden administration, that would be a great human rights, civil rights victory. But then you've got to push for Medicare single payer because it's the only way to create a cost-effective, human-centric healthcare system that serves the people, not rapacious insurance companies. What I would do if I was president, I would do a one-time buyout of all the insurance companies. Bye-bye, we're going to buy you out. And then all the workers who work in the insurance companies, we're going to hire you to do the reimbursements under a single-payer system. That's what I would do. And make sure that people realize that they're going to get the Rolls-Royce, the best system possible. I think I'm now drafting a new bill for California. I'm very excited about it. I'm drafting for the doctors there, a single-payer California bill. And I think if we get one state that goes single-payer and people can see that it works, that might be the magic formula.
Joel, thank you so much for coming on. Let's
Yeah.
talk about this more soon. Yeah, really appreciate you joining us. For everybody who's been listening, you've been listening to the voice of Joel Siegel. He's a former congressional staffer. He was the co-author of H.R. 676, and he's one of the leading architects for the passage of the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. We have 2 more great hours coming up. At 8:30 Eastern, we're talking with Yakov Shapiro about Zionism and Judaism, and at 9:30, we're speaking with Stephanie Kelton about modern monetary theory. 2 more hours, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the politically independent corner, I am radio show host Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. In the news, Georgia Governor Kemp issued an executive order Wednesday banning more than a dozen local governments in the state from mandating masks be worn in public. This comes as numbers of infections and deaths continue to escalate, with 84% of the hospitals already occupied. Georgia Governor Kemp issued the order after Mayor of Atlanta Keisha Lance Bottoms mandated through executive order that businesses must ensure masks are worn on premises. Kemp called this legally unenforceable. On the positive side, he does encourage people to wear a mask. He's just not going to ensure they do so. Israel is drafting a secret list of intelligence officials that could be arrested if they travel abroad and prosecuted for war crimes if the International Criminal Court at The Hague chooses to open an investigation into Israel and Hamas for war crimes. There are about 200 to 300 names, including Benjamin Netanyahu and Gantz. Many of Joe Biden's bundlers told CNBC that the renewed effort by business leaders is linked to the fact that Senator Bernie Sanders and more liberal candidates are no longer a threat to becoming president. I love that, a threat to becoming president. Donors to the Biden committee includes James Murdoch and Steven Spielberg and Merck's CEO Ken Frazier. The big money donor are capitalists, quote unquote. For a minute, Bernie was close to locking it up, but then came South Carolina. They were petrified of Trump and horrified by Sanders. Now, they actually have a choice. Before, they didn't. Unquote. Florida businessman and Biden bundler John Morgan told CNBC. Oh, they're licking their lips. They love it. Intelligence officials in the United States and the United Kingdom and Canada have accused Russia of trying to steal vaccines by hacking into them. Russia has denied this. Specifically, 3 Western countries are claiming that Cozy Bear APT-29 is responsible for the attack, which is the same method that CrowdStrike had claimed were the actions of a Russian group used to hack the DNC. I swear, you say anything about Russia and people will believe it. Yesterday morning, it was reported that 1.3 million people had filed for first-time jobless claims on a seasonal adjusted basis for the week ending in July 11th, according to the Department of Labor. That's down 10,000 from the prior week's revised level. On an unadjusted basis, more than 1.5 million people filed for first-time claims, which is up almost 109,000 from the week prior. The British government yesterday accused Russian actors of trying to meddle in the country's elections. The statement came from Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, the same individual that recently advanced the UK Magnitsky Act to foul new sanctions on officials in Russia, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, and North Korea. He said he was almost certain that unnamed individuals sought to interfere, quote-unquote, in December's 2019 election by amplifying online illicitly acquired and leaked government documents. Those documents were used by then leader of the main opposition Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, to back up his claim that the Conservative government was preparing to sell off the National Health Service. The Russian Foreign Minister spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, called Dominic Raab's statement vague and contradictory and called on the UK to produce facts. I hate to tell you, if you're living in the UK, Boris Johnson is exactly going to do just that. He is going to sell off the NHS. I'm sorry. He's going to take one plank at a time. A 2-day summit in the European Union is expected by many of its proponents, many of its prominent attendees, to show slow progress on reaching agreements to respond to COVID-19 and the widespread economic contraction many countries in the EU are facing. German Chancellor Angela Merkel said she expects very, very difficult negotiations, quote unquote. 15 women have accused staffers of the Washington Redskins of sexual harassment and verbal abuse. Some of the staffers are reportedly within Redskins owner Dan Snyder's inner ring. This follows the move by the team earlier this week to officially retire the Redskin name and logo. It has not been revealed its less offensive replacement. This is a story that we discussed yesterday that Washington Post was teasing, and so apparently they released it. Florida hits 150 deaths in a day, 14,000 new cases. Texas is more than 10,000 new cases. The United States has seen more than 77,000 confirmed cases, more than 10,000 new cases than the day before. Brazil has hit more than 2 million total coronavirus cases, and India has hit 1 million. It's funny how all of these governments are run by right-wingers. How strange and coincidental. Federal law enforcement officers have been using unmarked cars to arrest protesters in Portland, Oregon. Now, this was the subject of my monologue in the first segment at 7 a.m. Basically, they would drive up in an unmarked vehicle with unmarked agents, burlap sacking people, driving them around, eventually getting them potentially to the federal court. The problem here is that they're unmarked. Nobody knows who these people are, what agencies they work for, if they are committing any kind of crime, especially with the violence that we were seeing cops use all across the United States. So this is what is taking place in Portland. A change in Russian constitution bans same-sex marriage and adoption. Petol Tolstoy, a parliament member who supported the change to the constitution, said Russia is a stronghold of traditionalism, reflecting the widespread view that the country is under siege from decadent foreign influences. The amendment would allow Russia to, quote-unquote, not repeat the mistakes that exist in the West, he told the AP. These mistakes, in my opinion, are fundamental when certain people, the LGBTQ community, or certain racial groups are being given additional special rights, more than the majority. It's not special rights. It's just called, to some degree, liberty of equality. But you're all caught up. That is the news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Excellent. So the Washington Redskins one, I don't know what their name is going to be. And like you said, it's going to be something less offensive than what it currently is. Do you think that the abuse charges that they knew had to be coming up had anything? I mean, I think these things are unrelated, because I think the pressure that was coming on them from the other organizations that weren't going to be willing to sell their products anymore was enough in and of itself to force Snyder to change the name. But Snyder also knew, or he had to know, this story was coming up. I mean, Washington Post had teased this for multiple days. So the question becomes, what is going to happen to Snyder? Now, I am not a huge football person, and so I have no feelings about this one way or the other. I used to be a Washington fan, just growing up as a kid, and then I lost interest. Basically, it's a man running with a pigskin across a field. Now, I get don't get me wrong, I get the awesomeness of it, the adrenaline of it, just brutish men with muscles, 300 pounds, running over other men and other men trying to take those guys down. I get it. It's this kind of allegory for war to some degree. But, the injuries and everything else that's associated with it, I just lost interest. Now, but the question becomes, what happens to Snyder? What happens to his inner circle? And are they going to be calling for Snyder's head? Because this was allowed to basically propagate in the way that it was allowed to propagate. What do you think, Shane?
Man, I think so much. I mean, real quick, just because this is sort of one of the last things you were saying about sports and the sort of impetus to play sports. Yeah, that seems like a deeply human thing. So, I mean, there are parts of it that are a little bit martial or militaristic or whatever. You're going up against another team. But then I also look at it from the other side. Humans are practically the most social species on the planet. We're one of the only species to not just do synchronized games like war, but also to do synchronized dance. So there's, inherent propensities to both conflicts and sort of collaboration
that's compromise. That's the difference. Yeah, that's compromise though. Like it's these two interplaying things that, like, I grew up playing chess my entire life. And I was in tournaments by the time I was 13 years old or something, 14 years old, and I was playing in adult tournaments. I pushed my rating up to 2032 by the U.S. Chess Federation at its highest, and I was even stronger going into Blitz. I love it. I have this weird affinity for issues of war, even though I'm also horrified by it. It's this weird pull and pull. So I get it on this kind of really gut level of trying to subdue, to destroy, and how awesome it feels to put down an opponent. But let me ask you this. Do these things reinforce a society that is basically engulfed in conflict? Meaning, if you were trying to move your society to something that was less hostile, less belligerent, yes, get rid of the inequality, yes, deal with these issues to ensure that people have the basic things that they need, this kind of Maslow theory of needs. But also, do you have to get rid of things like John Wick movies? Like, I love my John Wick, but John Wick basically kills a lot of people over a dog. Now, and honestly, I felt it was justified, despite the fact that he was killing a lot of people. Is that a sickness in our society that needs to be in some way remedied in an odd way? Do you know what I mean by that? Like, are those things, meaning, can you have your sane and rational society where violence is either eliminated, where poverty is eliminated, where all these things are eliminated, and keep your John Wick movies?
So I hear you. This is a conversation that could be nuanced. I fall more on the opposite side. I'm about 70-80% that these things are broadly good. They're an outlet, and that attempts to sort of change human nature itself by changing the social structure that we're operating in they usually end in catastrophe. As far as I can tell, like long run projects to try to influence how human beings operate on a deep level and trying to implement those through social or legal reforms, even if it's just as stuff as simple as changing how people play sports or the extent to which people play violent sports or whatever. That stuff is complicated. It gets murky, and usually I think it backfires in a pretty strong way. I mean, with coming
civil
back
rights,
to the sort of actual
civil rights. That was exactly what the government did. When the government was changing over from taking a slave and saying, okay, this is now a person, and you have to treat this person like a person, and started to take action. I mean, even making the thing of saying, look, you can't segregate your business. I mean, if you talk to Ron or Rand Paul today, they'll still be complaining about that. How dare they tell me that I can't keep this, darky out of my business? And so, but that was a deep change that the government invested itself into in order to change the perspective of the nation, was it not?
It was, but it didn't change. And as far as I can tell, it didn't even try to change human nature fundamentally. It wasn't addressing like the deeper problem of the relationship between violence and society or something like that. It was addressing a specific instance of racism. And it's not like it tried to dissolve all boundaries between the in-group and the out-group. And those boundaries can be ethnic, they can be ideological, they can be cultural, whatever, there are all these different things that can separate us. That's where I'm coming back to it. I mean, another thing with the Redskins specifically, brought this up when we were interviewing Brandy Lewis Sims yesterday morning about this stuff, in anticipation of this article being released. I just wonder about a general economic contraction in NFL, in the sports industry more broadly, but specifically, you don't have seasons. Nike and FedEx came after him for the name change. And so that's a sort of specific instance of this. But broadly, if there's not enough money going around, I just see the propensity for these kinds of things to happen. Another interesting thing, and this isn't the most important part of it, but it's just interesting to note, with the Redskins name change being an explicitly racial problem, that sort of fits into the BLM movement. Now this is a little bit of it feels at least a little bit like an extension of the Me Too movement. So it's like the last two big sort of cultural movements in the past 5 or so years, maybe 3 years approximately. Those seem to have come together in an interesting way in the past week or two with this team, again, in the nation's capital. It's a prominent football team. So it's just interesting. I don't have any more to say on that, but it's just an interesting thing to note.
I think the BLM movement has expanded. Look, I've argued this for the last several years. If you look at the Russian Revolution, if you look at even what was taking place in France recently in regards to the Gilets Jaunes, the Yellow Vest movement, Hong Kong, movements, if they go on for a period of time, seems to escalate their demands. They almost seem to get this kind of like accretion disc where they kind of come together with an organization associated with them, at least the best of them. And those things take on broader demands. And so you have what might have started off as a specific issue of race with Black Lives Matter that started to expand into other areas of, people were pulling down statues associated with Hispanic history. So it wasn't just Black stuff anymore. Like, it really did propagate. I mean, like I said, many of the people that were out there weren't just Black. They spread the entire racial spectrum. But let's take a break because we're at 8:15. You can give me your response when you come back. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. A quick note for folks, you can catch us on the airwaves in Washington, D.C. at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. If you're in Kansas City, you can listen to us at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM, also 1140 AM. And with that out of the way, we are taking calls this segment. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. Again, that number is 202-521-1320. All right, moving into this. I'm going to note this briefly. You don't need to make this the topic of conversation for this segment. You can call in about whatever you want to. But coming back to this bit about the accusations of vaccine hacking, this is going to be a good time to go back over the foundations of the Russiagate story. Maybe we can get some people to interview about that too, talking about what Cozy Bear is, what APT-29 is, what those terms mean. As far as I can tell, those are terms not for groups. Those are terms for sort of suspected groups that would be using these methods, but really it's the methods that we're referring to. It's a set of little malware programs and then an association between those malware programs and like servers that, as far as I can tell, technically anybody could use. And anyway, it seems like what CrowdStrike did, we need to go back over this, and it seems like that's what's happening now, is they associated this method and these servers with a suspected group, and then they assumed who that group was, using sort of circumstantial light evidence, quote unquote evidence. They used that to assume that it was Russia. It seems like the same thing is happening now. And again, this is part of this weird wave, maybe not so weird, but part of this wave of anti-Russian stories coming out, between the Russian Taliban bounties program. Now this, Russia was recently accused not just of hacking the vaccines, but also of trying to hijack the UK's election. That's been coming out recently. It's just an interesting time. I wonder what's causing them to become the scapegoat again after a bit of a remission. And it seems like the last couple of months, most of the tension has been with China. So I wonder if it's just a balance of competition. I don't know. I don't know who's pushing for what, but that's my perception of events. What's your take, Jamarl?
So if I had to guess, and if it was me, and if I was in Congress or if I was in office, and if I had the perspective that I wanted unipolar world, meaning I want the United States. I agree with this notion that the U.S. should have basically power across the world. Now, I may even convince myself, kind of like Europe, that we are the axis to which the world is held up on. And if I take that perspective, then anything that intrudes upon that is a problem for me. And I need to do things that basically undermine the other powers in this process. What I have at my disposal is a huge amount of economic might. I have allies of the Patsy nations that are in Europe. I also have military power, and I have media power, because the media will basically repeat anything that is said, and the media platform of the United States is a massive one, and it will be repeated by countries in Europe. So it's a bite, kick, scratch, anything that you can get at your disposal to try to undermine your opponent. Look at what they did to Trump. They hit Trump with everything plus the kitchen sink. Oh, he got peed on by a hooker. I mean, this is astonishing stuff. But that wasn't necessarily beyond them doing so. All of these things have to do with trying to injure, hurt your opponent. If you can't do it militarily, if you can't do it economically, then you do it from the standpoint of perspective. For example, the Tillerson memo. The Tillerson memo was the memo that was given to Tillerson explaining to him that, look, the United States foreign policy boils down to whatever is in U.S. interests. Anything that is not in U.S. interest or domain of influence, you attack those countries. So, like North Korea, South Korea, China, or for that matter, Russia or Iran or Syria, all of those countries become subject to attack verbally and based on accusations for that very specific reason that they're not within the control of the U.S. influence. That is all over the world. And so if you're looking at countries that we don't particularly like, you will find that the media is very complicit and going along with stories against those countries. It is almost like it would be no different than state media almost. That's what we are. I mean, I think that kind of boils down to what we see in regards to foreign policy from, just a rational, honest perspective.
I could see that. Yeah, I totally see that too.
People have a hard time seeing that sometimes because I think they look at the world in the way that they relate to things. And I don't think entirely that people in power look at the world in those terms. If you're in the point of view that this is indeed zero sum and your job and your goal is to advance your interests in any way that you can advance your interests, then letting up pressure is not the way to do it. In their mind, this is not what all of us kind of make out on great terms. We, I think, have a deep belief that if we let up off the gas or let up off the pressure, that other countries would do to us in regards to what we've done to other countries in regards to the terrorism, the bombing, the undermining the governments, the toppling governments and putting in dictators. And so we have this notion that we need to retain control. And in trying to retain control, this is what you get. I mean, if you think of the things that were said, the attacks against Hong Kong, the attacks against Russia, anything that's said against Russia is taken by mainstream media and ran with. Anything that's said about China is taken with mainstream media and ran with. Donald Trump has said that China was stealing from us. This is something similar that Europe said about the United States when we were becoming a major power. Like, people, I don't think the country necessarily sees it that way, but if you ask the country how they see China, the number is very low. Same thing with the Russians. You can say anything about Russia and get away with it. It works. It really does. It's sad, but it is the way that we do our politics.
It's true, man. Yeah, it's a trap that we've been stuck in. Something I've been thinking about. We've been talking about the post-World War II era, the significance of that. A lot of people will criticize the baby boomers, or quote unquote boomers. I understand the impetus, but really what I'd focus on is just the sort of economic conditions. Here's where I'm going with this. In the post-World War II era, this sort of unprecedented era of economic surplus in the United States, especially relative to the rest of the world. Now, we quickly reinvested a lot of that. We sort of quickly mobilized on that in order to support our world order. The reason I brought the baby boomer thing up is, as far as I can tell, a lot of the people who grew up in that phase, just psychologically, if you think about growing up in a sort of phase of unaccountable and unmitigated economic surplus over the course of a couple of decades, a lot of those people are still in positions of supreme power. And so thinking generationally in terms of the dynamics, the cultural dynamics at play here, I just see a lot of unaccountable sort of decisions. Again, not saying boomers are like this per se. It's more just the sort of governance class, as far as I can tell, that grew up under these conditions of unmitigable power around the world. And so with that lack of account comes a lack of responsibility. And with a lack of responsibility, in some sense, comes a lack of wisdom. And I see that very clearly in a lot of the decisions that they've been making. This ties back into the China and Russia stuff you were just talking about. For a while there, it seemed like, from the 90s, the 2000s, the knots of this century, it seemed like there were different attempts being made to sort of reconcile with other national powers. And then they got kind of powerful again. Russia sort of rebounded from the 90s to some degree. And then China obviously has just been ascendant since, arguably the 70s, the 80s, however you want to pin it, very much so since the 90s, clearly. But we've had to sort of reconcile ourselves with that. And that's not something the governance class is used to. And so for a bit there, it seemed like, hey, maybe this might be a kumbaya moment, even though the whole terrorism thing was happening and we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. But then it seems like it's faded away. And that's been so damn frustrating to witness, man.
Here's the question. If roles were reversed, now Gorbachev wanted to make peace. He clearly wanted to make peace. And in doing so, it's almost like if you go to a planet and you say, look, I'm going to liberate this planet because this guy is a dictator and he's in office. And despite being a dictator, everybody had food, clothing, shelter, their needs were met and everything else, but the guy was still a dictator. And maybe he would kill 2 or 3 people over the course of a year. You liberate them and that goes into a civil war. Meaning just because you do something that's good doesn't necessarily mean the outcome is going to be what you consider to be good. It may be horrific because it has to go through its course of action. If the United States was the country that imploded as opposed to the U.S. Soviet Union, would they have done the same thing? Now, I guess this goes to this question of what is the ideology of the people who are in power when they're dealing with somebody else who collapsed. Meaning the Soviet Union was our enemy. It was our foil. I mean, Kennedy was using this missile gap stuff even though he knew it was absolutely not true, in order to use them as a foil for his ambitions to get into office. And so once they collapsed, we considered it, we won. We won. Those were our major players. We won. In the game of life, the U.S. is number one. Now, this didn't breed a thing of, okay, let's be kumbaya. This bred a thing of victory, a victory march. We can do whatever we want. And like you said, it gets to this notion of unaccountable power. And maybe the problem is there wasn't a secondary power. I know this is a really horrible way to say it, but it just seems like we have a gangster foreign policy. The international law stuff is selective, meaning it doesn't really exist. If you have the United States that can invade Iraq and kill 1 million people and they're not brought up on charges, then it doesn't exist. You can't tell me that there's a such thing as international law, regardless of how many African dictators that you may end up hanging at The Hague. But in this very specific case, maybe the issue is that there's no secondary power. Like there's nothing in order to kind of keep this other power in check. Because there's some countries that you wouldn't dare invade if you know that it would provoke a war. Meaning, go back to the Korean War, for example. I forget who's in office at the time. I want to say Eisenhower, but I could be wrong on that. But the president flipped out over that. Because it was one of those things, what are you going to do? You're going to start a war with China? Are you insane? And so maybe it's a secondary power thing, but that also means that you're always at the state of brinksmanship, where somebody can all blow it up with a push of a button. I don't necessarily know how you extricate yourself from that, right? I mean, that's one of those things where there's a certain amount of leadership that has to have a very specific perspective or an ideology that just grows, where there's a level of cooperation that takes place that just doesn't seem to be there now. And I don't know how to get to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, another side of this, I'll go philosophical for just a second before coming back to the practical. If you have this era of, again, like unmitigated unaccountability, where you're not accountable to anybody and nobody can stop you from being accountable to anybody because you're stronger than everybody else, that doesn't just bleed a lack of responsibility. I think it also breeds this weird kind of abstraction where, basically you're able to detach yourself from the reality that you're dealing with because you don't need to deal with the feedback loops that are telling you that you're wrong. So in the United States, that looked a lot more like the increasing encroachment of the government on media, on sort of these cultural aspects of American society. And part of the problem there, if you're not in touch with reality, if you've abstracted too much, then sometimes you just make these catastrophically wrong decisions. Now, you brought up nukes. This is where it gets a little bit more practical. Again, a lot of nuclear warheads still out there that could start flying pretty quickly if things go haywire. That's right. And I don't see people in positions of power who have any apparent sense about how to keep things from going haywire. It's like you're talking about, this is such a common phrase, I'm spacing on it for a second, brinksmanship. You're talking about brinksmanship. The problem, it's like if you're trying to push that line, if you're trying to sort of push as much aggression as you can to keep your military industrial complex going without crossing over the line. And if you're doing this based on abstractions, on an era of, again, unaccountability where you didn't really have to
Something's
think
gonna
too
happen
seriously.
bad.
Yeah, something terrible is going to happen. That's my take.
Yeah, I don't know how you avoid it. And that's kind of, I guess, my point. It's like if you're stuck in this kind of weird world where at the moment that you have a power that's so power, like a superpower, and for the most part, the sole superpower, well, that country just basically says, we won. You have neocons in both of the parties that basically tried to pick over the spoils. Which is a horrible outcome because we can see what's taking place in the Middle East in regards to all of those countries that we were invading. By the same token, if you have a secondary power that has a similar ability in order to kind of be a counterbalance and to provide a second point of view of the world, but because you have that secondary point of view of the world, you can have this thing where two maniacs could end up in power in both of these countries and it goes up in smoke. I mean, for the most part, look at Hitler, for example. I mean, I would argue that Hitler was derivative of the First World War, but still, you had a maniac who basically was able to torch the world all by himself because he was willing to use his military powers to go there. One of the interesting things that I never quite understood, it's like if you have a peace treaty where you can say, let's bring it down to 10,000 nukes, doesn't that automatically set the precedent that you can bring it down to zero? It's like, how can you have a treaty for 10,000 but not zero? It's like you're always keeping that ace in the hole. Either way, let's end this here. Because we can talk about this for hours and that there are other news to get to. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? Forget the spoon-fed sound bites from the pundits who know so little about so much. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardrooms of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for change speak and are heard loud and clear, 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're joined for this segment by Rabbi Yakov Shapiro. He's a speaker, author, and rabbi. And real quick, so people can know where to find him, you can find him over on Twitter at Yakov_Shapiro. That's YAAKOV_Shapiro. You can also find his videos on YouTube. Do a search for True Torah Jews. You can also buy his books over on Amazon. Those books include The Empty Wagon. Again, the title of that book is The Empty Wagon. You can also read more of his work on his website, truetorahjews.org. Rabbi Shapiro, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Hey, thank you for coming on. Before we get into this, I just want to express some personal thanks. When my dad was in the hospital, my dad, Lee Stranahan, the former co-host of the show, when he was in the hospital, you were one of the few people he wanted to call and that we called for support during a really stressful and emotional time, and you came through with that support. So just thank you for being there for my family.
You're welcome. Yeah, God made your dad a really nice guy.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you again for your support there. All right, so let's get into this. We're going to be going over some of the basics of what you've talked about many times on this show. I'm going to be learning stuff. I know Jamarl's going to be learning stuff too. We'll be going over the sort of relationship between Zionism and Judaism. Interesting topic that I think a lot of people get wrong, and I think you have a very unique perspective on. So just maybe for starters, where are you coming from? Sort of what was your upbringing in this tradition, and then how did you form your views on Israel as it relates to Judaism? Maybe we can start there.
Right. Well, my views aren't really as unique as one may think. They're unique in terms of what you hear on the radio, because there aren't many people from my school of thought that speak out in public. And that school of thought is simple Orthodox Judaism. Judaism is what I grew up with. I've been studying Judaism. I'm a rabbi. Since I'm in grade school, I've been studying Judaism. And Zionism is simply against our religion. It's as simple as that. The idea that there's a connection between Zionism and Judaism is not only not true, the opposite is true. And the original Zionists, the architects of Zionism, made no qualms about that, so no secrets about that. What happened was that the Zionists needed to recruit more Jews to their movement, and people were losing interest in Zionism. The people that didn't like Judaism, they were losing interest in it. They thought, Theodor Herzl wrote this climax of his book, The Jewish State, which is the manifesto of Zionism. The last page, climax, he said, once Zionism gets off the ground, anti-Semitism will disappear. Leo Pinsker wrote the same thing. The idea of Zionism was, once we take the Jews and make them normal, as opposed to the religious Jews, or the Jews like me, who are abnormal, in the words of Vladimir Jabotinsky, ugly, weak, cowardly, etc. They had all the anti-Semitic tropes, the Zionists, and they felt that the reason why the anti-Semites don't like Jews is because, well, just look at them. The anti-Semites are right. Vladimir Jabotinsky, who Benjamin Netanyahu considers his mentor, said, quote, I know I'm a Zionist because the Jewish people are a nasty people. Neighbors hate it, and they're right. Its ends will be above our unite. So Jabotinsky and all the original Zionists, they created Zionism in order to end anti-Semitism, not to protect themselves from it. That's what they believed. Turns out it wasn't true. Obviously, it didn't work that way. Since Zionism, the first Zionist Congress was 1897. Zionism started about 50 years, let's say, a little more before that. The 20th century was the worst century for anti-Semitism, like in the history of the world. You're talking about the Holocaust. So Zionism clearly did not end anti-Semitism. Not only that, but Israel suffered from big bouts of inflation, tremendous amounts of wars, never mind anti-Semitism, wars. Ben-Gurion said that, well, the Arabs, which today we call the Palestinians, they'll welcome us with open arms when we show them what we can do for them by developing their country. Jabotinsky, who was Ben-Gurion's political competition, he said, no, they're not going to accept us. We just have to be stronger than them and show them our guns, and then we have to beat them into submission, and that's all. And there are wars with the Arabs, one way or the other. It's never ending. There really is very little reason for somebody to be a Zionist. So people started losing interest. And what the Zionists did was they kind of shifted their ideology from, let's say, socialist Zionism, which is Ben-Gurion, and they moved it more towards nationalist ideology. In 1977, Menachem Begin became prime minister, which ended the reign of the socialist Zionists, the labor Zionists, Ben-Gurion guys, and started what we have today, the Netanyahu guys, the Likud. And these guys were more nationalist, very fascist influence, very, very fascist influence, and they started a very strong, organic, ethnic nationalism, and they needed to recruit the religious Jews, or to even more so to portray themselves as more the Jewish people rather than just random Zionists. Theodor Herzl really had no interest in any Jewish culture, any Jewish nationalism, or anything. In fact, in Herzl's vision of what he called the Jewish state, they did not even speak Hebrew. Herzl was basically interested in making another Switzerland, and that didn't work. So they changed to a different type of Zionism, where they invented a Jewish nationality. Jews are not a nationality, we're a religion. But the Zionists said, no, we're a nationality, we're one people. Politically, Israel is the state of all the Jews all over the world. We have an exclusivity. God gave us this land. Now, these people don't believe in God. Ben-Gurion didn't believe in God, but he said the Bible is his mandate. He didn't believe that God wrote the Bible. God gave us the land, but we don't believe in the Bible, and we're the ancient Hebrews, and this nationalist thing. And then they mixed it into religion. They said, oh, the Jewish religion really kind of culminates into Zionism, and they engaged in almost a century's worth of propaganda and indoctrination. Ben-Gurion actually hired a man named Ben-Zion Diener to create a nationalist version of Jewish history. It's complete fiction. Their version of Jewish history, complete fiction. It's like many nationalist versions of history. It's mythology. But this mythology, this mythological people that they created, that they call the Jews, it's just a homonym to what I call Jews. This mythological people that they created, this political nation called the Jewish people, who they can't even define, by the way. They can't even define what a Jew is. And I'll explain to you some of the glaring contradictions that they have in their own laws about who is a Jew. And they made this kind of really organic nationalism, like they have white nationalists today, or they are the black nationalists, the Marcus Garvey guys, the Malcolm X guys. They made Jewish nationalism. But whereas white people, we know what a white person is, and we know what a black person is. We know what a Ukrainian person is, if you want Ukrainian nationalism or Slavic nationalism. They invented this people and convinced people that their identity as a Jew is connected somehow to some nationality which is centered in some state in the Middle East that was created in 1948. So I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example of the propaganda, and you've all been subject to it. You've all seen it, but you probably never realized its subliminal effect. You walk into a department store in December, let's say Macy's, Walmart, and you'll see the Christmas display. The Christmas display is invariably colored green and red. Then you walk into the Hanukkah display. What color is the Hanukkah display always depicted? Blue and white. What in the world's connection does Hanukkah have with the colors blue and white? We know white, green, and red represents Christmas. That's the holiday. But what does a blue and white have to do with Hanukkah? Nothing. It's the Israeli flag. It's a subliminal linking between Jewishness, the Jewish religion, and Zionism, and there really is no connection. And after a century of this type of indoctrination, brainwashing, plus one more very important factor is the fear-mongering, the Holocaust. Always remember the Holocaust, that's a good thing to remember, but the lesson they learned from the Holocaust is that, okay, we need Israel. Without Israel, there's going to be another Holocaust. The day Israel disappears, Hitler's parting away with the Jews into the oven. The Jews in America are not safe. Only Israel makes them safe. The Jews in England are not safe. Only the Jews in Israel are safe. The truth of the matter is, the Jews in Israel are least safe of all the Jews all over the world. More Jews are killed in Israel because they're Jews than anywhere else in the world by far. Double, triple, quadruple. The chances of getting killed in Israel because we're Jews. Much more than quadruple. Yet,
Yakov,
it's an ideology.
Yakov, you're basically making the argument that Zionism is a fascist, nationalistic political movement that cloaks itself in the religion of Judaism in order to expand its numbers and to use anti-Semitism as kind of a club to hit people who are saying anything about it. How much of this is self-interest? Meaning, when I look back over history and I look back at the United States, and they make these arguments about, people being less than human beings, how much of that was self-interest, or how much of that is self-interest in that country, and how much of that is actually believed by the people who live there?
When you say the Jewish religion, most Zionists are not religious at all. Benjamin Netanyahu does not follow anything of the Jewish religion. He does not keep the Shabbat, he does not eat kosher food, nothing. That's part of the illusion. They cloaking it in the only element of Jewishness that ever existed, that is the religion, without even being religious. They kind of secularized the whole religion, and they made it into something that really doesn't make any logical sense. Netanyahu's not religious. Ben-Gurion is not religious. These people are completely unreligious at all. They don't believe in Judaism at all. And how much of it is self-interest? It started off self-interest. But what happens often with ideology, especially ideologies that Zionism is really a religion, the godless religion, kind of like communism. What happens with these ideologies is that the ideologies kind of take over the people, they possess them. So that whereas at the beginning these ideologies were created to serve the people, at the end the people end up serving the ideology, and they get their identity from the ideology. So I'll give you an example. Zionism is not self-serving. Zionism is not in the interest of the Zionist people. If the Zionists would just be normal people without the ideology of Zionism, I think that they for sure be better off. For example, they make Jerusalem the capital of Israel, right? It was a big thing. What did they gain by that? A material gain. When you say self-serving, how did they serve themselves by doing it? They gained nothing. They lost a lot of political goodwill from countries all over the world. They got themselves into even more hotter water with the Palestinians. There was actual physical repercussions. There was a Jew that was stabbed in retaliation in the central bus station in Jerusalem. Even a Jewish store in Holland was blown up, firebombed. They gained nothing from it. They did not serve themselves. They served their God.
That is the voice. Yakov, we're going to come back. We've got to go into a break right now, but we'll come back, keep talking about this issue. For everybody who's been listening, that was the voice of Rabbi Yakov Shapiro, speaker, writer, author. We'll be back with him in just a minute. Till then, know that you're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Fault lines.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here.
Real opinions for real people.
Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out,
We actually let them expand on their views.
what's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault lines.
And we're back. If you're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're joined by Rabbi Yakov Shapiro. He is a speaker, writer, and author. Quick note, if you want to find his work on his website, you can. That website is truetorahjews.org. You can also read his book, The Empty Wagon. You can buy that on Amazon. You can also watch his videos over on YouTube at True Torah Jews. Anyway, with that stuff out of the way, glad to say it. I want to get back into this conversation. I want to take this conversation in a slightly different direction, but you were getting to it towards the end of your last comment. There's this issue of Jewish identity. One of the things you mentioned early on in that last segment was the sort of definition of a Jew, and a lot of the changes that you're describing cut to the core of what it means to be a Jew. Whether it's a religious thing, as it seems to be fundamentally, or it's a nationalist thing, as it seems to have become, like you're saying. That's the issue. So maybe in your own words, just to start us off in the second segment, how would you define a Jew?
A Jew is defined, a Jew is a job description. God told the Jews at Mount Sinai, story in the Bible, that they are obligated to fulfill the Torah. Whoever is obligated to fulfill the Torah is a Jew. You can convert to Judaism, it's a religion. You can be born into it, or you're born into Judaism if your mother is Jewish, and that's because the religion says so. That's it. Thousands of years, that's all Jewish has meant. The problem was that in the late 19th century, when Jews had freedom from religion as well as freedom of religion, many Jews decided they don't like being Jewish, and they assimilated. The problem for them was that the anti-Semites persecuted them as Jews, even though they didn't identify in any way with the Jewish religion. In 1881 in Russia, terrible pogroms broke out and thousands of Jews were killed. And therefore, these people were stuck between a rock and a hard place. They didn't want to be Jews, but the non-Jews would not let them be non-Jews. So where are they? That started an identity crisis amongst these assimilated Jews. And they had different solutions. There was communism. Some Jews said, okay, you know what, let's be communists and we'll get a new identity. And a lot of Jews went for communism because communism is portrayed as equality between all people. There were the Bolsheviks, various different isms that popped up. Zionism was one of them. Zionism was not the dominant one, but it was one that had its center outside of Europe, which ended up being very fortunate for it, because after the Holocaust, there was no more Jews. There were very little Jews left in Europe, and Zionism basically survived because it took place in the Middle East. And plus, Zionism promised the Jews a safe place, and et cetera. So Zionism became the dominant alternative towards Jewish identity as a religion. The problem is that they cannot define what a Jew is. It's an artificial definition. So, for example, they have a law, the law of return, right? Everybody knows if you're a Jew, you can come to Israel and be a citizen. All right, who qualifies as a Jew? How are you going to define Jew? You know, if they would say all African Americans, all black people can come to the national state of the black people, you know what a black person is. Well, what's a Jew? So they use, the most part, religious law. If your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish. In some ways, they use Hitler's definition of Jew. Hitler decided, of course, he's not going to follow the Jewish religious law. He's going to decide who's a Jew, and anybody who had any grandparents up the paternal or maternal who's a Jew, then he's a Jew, even though according to Jewish law he's not. But they decided, they had various different court cases regarding people who claimed to be Jewish and actually were Jewish. But according to the law of return, they're not.
Wait, but just so I'm clear,
Daniel.
and just to nail this down, you're basically making the point that they're taking something that's a religion and is infusing it into almost biology in somewhat of a weird way. It's like if a person is an African American, you see
that. That's exactly what Hitler did, you know. And Hitler in Mein Kampf Chapter 2 says that the Jews are not Germans; they're Jews. They're their own nationality. And if you don't believe me, he said, I had this idea that they're not really Germans, but what settled any doubt in my mind was Zionism. Just go ask the Zionists, Chapter 2, Mein Kampf. He says Zionism, even the Jews that aren't Zionists, they don't kick the Zionists out of Judaism. So anybody who at least even tolerates Zionism really indicates that the Jews are a nationality. Now, yes, Jabotinsky, Moses Hess, there were Zionists that said Jews are a race. Hitler said Jews are a race. But they can't say Jews are a race because Jews are from very different races. Ivanka Trump is Jewish and Ethiopian Jews are Jewish, right? They're not of the same race. They're not of the same culture. So what are they? See, they asked this to Ben-Gurion and he said Jews don't have a definition, which makes it kind of hard to say who's Jewish. So there was this guy, Brother Daniel. He was born Jewish. And in the Holocaust, his mother left him in a monastery, to be saved, and they ran off. And he grew up and decided to convert to Christianity, and he became a Carmelite monk. He helps Jews in the Holocaust by hiding them and harboring them. And he decided that he wants to move to Israel and become a citizen under the law of return, because according to Jewish law, Jewish religious law, you cannot convert Judaism. Brother Daniel, although he believed Jesus is the Messiah, he was considered Jewish according to Jewish law. So he wants to go to the so-called Jewish state. And they say, wait, you're Christian. He said, yeah, but I'm born Jewish, so I'm according to law, I'm Jewish. They had a Supreme Court case, and they decided he's not entitled to be Jewish under the law of return. Now, Ben-Gurion then asked a lot of people for advice, a lot of advisors, and many people told him, especially the rabbis, they said, I don't understand. An atheist who doesn't believe in any God or any Messiah, you would accept as a Jew under the law of return because he's born Jewish. But if this guy is not an atheist, he believes in a God, and he believes that Jesus is the Messiah, you're not accepting him as a Jew? If you're accepting Jewish law, they're both Jewish. If you're accepting based on their religion, then why is an atheist more of a Jew than somebody who believes that Jesus is the Messiah? And there is no answer to this. Ben-Gurion did not have an answer. It's just that they want this elusive flavor of Judaism, of Jewishness, of something, chicken soup, or their own culture, hummus, or the hora, or they want to have the power to decide what Jewishness is. It's an identity theft. That's the subtitle to my book, From Identity Crisis to Identity Theft. They are hijacking the Jewish identity and making it into something that they really have not defined, nationality, race, somewhere. None of those definitions really work because we have Jews of all cultures, all nationalities, all races, right? I mean, look, the Zionists scream anti-Semite. To anybody who claims that Zionism requires dual loyalty of American Jews, okay? And to say Jews are duly loyal because they're Jews is anti-Semitic. But at the same time, the Zionists claim, they just made a law, the nation-state law, that their country is the state of all Jews all over the world. You see, Israel's different than all other countries all over the world, and different than any country that ever existed. America is the country of the Americans, and France is the country of the French. Israel's not the country of the Israelis. Israel claims to be the country of the Jews. That's just false. And it's the only country in the world that claims to be, let's say, my country. I never lived in Israel. I don't plan on living in Israel. I don't come from Israel. And yet, because I'm born Jewish, Israel, by their law, which has no jurisdiction over me, says that they are my country. Now, by international law, I have the right to change my nationality. I don't like America. I could move to Mexico and become a Mexican. But But no matter where I live, no matter what country I run to, according to Zionism, Israel is always my country because I was born Jewish. Unless the only way out, if I decide to believe in Jesus, then they'll leave me alone. If I decide there's no God, I'm an anti-Zionist, no, they're my country. What kind of crazy thing is this? Zionism is a wacko ideology. It's nonsensical. And the reason why they have it is because it was designed at the beginning with the goal of ending anti-Semitism in mind. It didn't work. So now it's like a company whose product line failed, and now they have to create new products or new mission statements, right? And so they're floundering and struggling with their own identity. That's why today you'll find different people saying Zionism means different things to different people. Let me tell you what Zionism means. Zionism means, one, the Jewish people are a nationality, and two, Israel is their state. That's Zionism. It doesn't mean national it was not the national self-determination movement of the Jewish people like Abba Eban and other Israeli diplomats said. Number one, it was not the movement of the Jewish people, it was the movement of the Zionists. They just claimed to represent the Jewish people falsely. Two, it's not even a self-determination movement in the traditional sense of the word. A self-determination movement is like we had here in the United States. There are a bunch of colonists from Britain living here, and they decided they don't want to be under anybody else's rule. They want to be under their own rule. But the Zionism said it's not that a bunch of Jews in, let's say, Seattle said we don't want to be under someone else's rule. What they said was that all Jews, wherever they are, whether they are happy in their countries or not, are now going to become a nationality, and we're going to take this piece of land, and this is going to be the nation state of the Jewish people. That's a different concept altogether. And that invention was created by Israeli diplomats in the early 70s, maybe late 60s, in order to sanitize what the real definition of Zionism is. Zionism is the idea
Yakov,
that Jews are a nationality, Israel is their state. Yeah.
Wait, Yakov, before we go, because we're getting down to the last minute or two before we have to leave, the country Israel, that wasn't one of the original countries that they were looking in order to set up location, correct? I mean, even though it's religiousized right now and it's kind of weaved into this kind of religious myth of sorts, there were other countries that they were looking for settling Israelis or Jews in, or Zionists in.
Ironically, the religious Jews who were involved with that Zionist project, Rabbi Ryan, he was their leader, he said he doesn't want Palestine because it's going to be a war zone. He would rather have the Uganda plan because all he needed was a safe place for Jews to live. Herzl said, for marketing purposes, you're not going to get Jews to move to some pseudo-Uganda territory. You need something that tugs at their heartstrings, the Holy Land, the nostalgia, the connection between the Holy Land and the Jews. That's the only way you're going to market Zionism, by connecting it to concepts and symbols that the Jews already relate to. Switch the symbols, twist them, distort them, but keep the symbols, keep the name brand, Holy Land, Palestine. That's the only way you're going to accomplish anything. So that's why there was a big disagreement amongst the Zionists during the first Zionist Congress, or the second Zionist Congress, regarding what land to take. But the votes was go for Palestine. This was Herzl's reason, because of marketing.
Thank you so much for joining us. That is the voice of Yakov Shapiro. Really appreciate you being with us today, Yakov.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you. Hopefully we can get you back on soon. For everybody who's been listening, that was Rabbi Yakov Shapiro. He's a speaker, author, and a rabbi. You can watch his videos on YouTube. Do a search for True Torah Jews. That's True Torah Jews. You can also check out his website, truetorahjews.org, and buy his book, including The Empty Wagon. That's over on Amazon. You can also follow him on Twitter at Yakov_Shapiro. That's Yakov with a Y and 2 A's. We have another great hour coming up at 9:30. We're going to be talking with Stephanie Kelton about modern monetary theory. Should be an interesting conversation. Really looking forward to that. In any event, we'll be back in just a minute. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live again from the divided states of America. It's time now for the show that brings you more sides of the issues that matter. You can see it from how it's gone so far. Interesting conversations. In the politically independent corner, I'm investigative radio show host Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever vigilant, the last man on the wall with Shane Stranahan, my co-host, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Together, sitting on that wall, we are Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Okay, man, I appreciate you. I had complained about you not including me on the wall. You really came through. You've been including me on the wall.
You're on the wall, man.
Thank you. I'm just gonna. You've shown your goodwill.
Didn't have a bath in 3 months. No supplies. Last man on the wall. That's how I see it.
It's been tough. It's been tough on that wall. Hopefully, we can take turns. But I just wanted to free you from the obligation. You no longer need to include me if you don't want to. Sometimes I'm, going to the bathroom, vice versa. I'm not always on the wall. But anyway, going to headlines now after that silly nothingness. In Georgia Governor Brian Kemp issued an executive order on Wednesday, 2 days ago, banning more than a dozen local governments in his state from mandating masks be worn in public. This came as the number of infections and deaths continued to escalate, with 84% of the hospitals in the state already occupied. This is also partly a response to the mayor of Atlanta, Keisha Lance Bottoms, who mandated through her own executive order that businesses must ensure masks are worn on their premises. Governor Kemp called that legally unenforceable. On the positive side, he does encourage people to wear masks. He's just not required to ensure. He's just not requiring that they do so. In our second story today, Israel has drafted a secret list of intelligence officials. Apparently, it could be arrested if they travel abroad, could be prosecuted for war crimes by the ICC, the International Criminal Court, if the ICC chooses to open an investigation into Israel and Hamas for war crimes. There are about 200 to 300 names on this secret list, reportedly. And reportedly among those names are Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz, the two co-leaders of the Israeli government. In our third story today, many of Joe Biden's bundlers, basically his fundraisers, told CNBC that the renewed effort by these business leaders is linked to the fact that Senator Bernie Sanders and more liberal candidates are no longer a threat to becoming president. Basically, they've secured the guy they want, the sort of safe dude, and now they're really down to support him. Donors to the Biden committees included James Murdoch, Steven Spielberg, and Merck CEO Ken Frazier. And I'm going to quote here, the big money donors are capitalists. For a minute, Bernie was close to locking it up, but then came South Carolina. They were petrified of Trump and horrified by Bernie. Now they actually have a choice. Before they didn't. End quote. That is the voice, well, my voice, but that's the speech of John Morgan, Florida businessman and Biden bundler. In our fourth story today, intelligence officials in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada have accused Russia of trying to steal vaccines by electronic hacking. Russia has denied this. Specifically, the United States, the UK, and Canada said that this hacking attempt is coming from Cozy Bear /APT29, which for inveterate followers of this story, you'll remember, were the groups basically blamed for the DNC hack back in 2016 by CrowdStrike. So it seems like they're bringing that back in again. I want to have more on this soon, and I want to get back into the story because I've been out of it for a little bit. But from memory, this wasn't actually ever a defined group. It was a method that they associated with some servers, and then based on circumstantial evidence, they assumed that it was a group. But again, if somebody wanted to, with all the results released as far as I can tell, they could just spoof that group. So somebody could come in, use the same malware, use the same sets of servers, which aren't private. They're accessible for other people to buy and use. They could do that to spoof this. That would get confusing. Anyway, my point is they've definitely jumped the gun again, and now they're blaming Russia directly like they did last time. Specifically, actually, they've gotten some pushback. I'm going to move on to another story related. The British government yesterday accused, quote-unquote, Russian actors of trying to meddle in that country's elections. The statement comes from Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab. You may remember a few weeks ago we were talking about Dominic as the main sponsor, the main person pushing and reciting the UK Magnitsky Act. He was personally thanked by Bill Browder, again, the sort of guy at the center of the Magnitsky Act. That Magnitsky Act filed due sanctions on officials in Russia, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, and North Korea. Anyway, back to these accusations. He has just released a letter accusing, again, Russian actors of trying to meddle in the country's elections. What is he accusing them of doing? Well, he said he was, quote, almost certain, end quote, that unnamed individuals sought to interfere in the December 2019 election by amplifying online, quote, illicitly acquired and leaked government documents, end quote. Those documents were used by the then leader of the main opposition Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, to back up his claims that the Conservative government was preparing to, quote, sell off, end quote, the NHS, the National Health Service, the British healthcare agency. The Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova, called Rab's statement vague and contradictory, that's a quote, and called on the UK to produce facts. In our next story, a two-day summit on the European Union is expected by many of its more prominent attendees to show slow progress on reaching agreements to respond to COVID-19 and the widespread economic contractions many countries in the EU and around the world face. German Chancellor Angela Merkel said she expects, quote, very, very difficult negotiations, end quote. In our next story, yesterday morning, it was reported that another 1.3 million people had filed first-time jobless claims. That's on a seasonally adjusted basis, taking into account, seasonal fluctuations in who's working where, what jobs you tend to see coming and going during this time. And this is for the week ending July 11th. It is down 10,000 from the prior week's revised level, but on an unadjusted, you don't take into account those seasonal fluctuations. More than 1.5 million people filed first-time claims in that period, which is up almost 109,000 claims from the week before. And in our next story, 15 women have accused staffers for the Washington Redskins of sexual harassment and verbal abuse. Some of those staffers being accused are reportedly within Redskin owner Dan Snyder's inner ring. So people haven't pointed their finger at Dan Snyder directly. They haven't accused him, as far as I can see so far, of sexual harassment or verbal abuse. But he's definitely, he seems to be the sort of center. It seems like a lot of people are not pointing their fingers at him, but they're saying that, again, he's responsible for it as the owner. And a lot of the people who might be culpable were close to him. This, of course, also follows the move by the team earlier this week to officially retire the Redskins name and logo. And again, it has not yet been revealed what the less offensive replacement for the name and logo is going to be that is forthcoming. In our next story, Florida has hit over 150 deaths from COVID-19 in a day. They've also seen a total of more than 14,000 new confirmed cases of the coronavirus. Texas has more than 10,000 total new cases, and the United States as a whole has seen more than 77,000 confirmed cases in the last day. That's more than 10,000 new cases than the day before. And we're now steadily approaching Fauci's sort of warning a little while back about potentially seeing 100,000 new infections every day. In Brazil, they've hit more than 2 million total coronavirus cases. India has reportedly hit more than 1 million total coronavirus cases, although, of course, with over 3.5 million last I checked, the United States is still the world's epicenter by a pretty wide margin. In our next story, federal law enforcement officers have been using unmarked cars to arrest protesters in Portland, Oregon. We actually talked about this, and this was the subject of Jamarl's monologue. If you want to go back and listen, he gives that at about 7:07 a.m. Eastern, and then we talk about it a little bit there, and then in the next segment too. Anyway, this is definitely worrying. We got into that conversation there. Feel free to go back and check that out. And then I'll briefly note this. Jamarl threw this one in here too. A change in Russia's constitution bans same-sex marriage and adoption. This was for the constitution elected back on July 1st, I believe was the date. Most notable, as far as what got reported at the time, was the extension of the term limits for Putin, basically resetting his presidential term limits. That's what got all of the heat back then. This was also included, and I've seen stories about this coming out in the past 3 or 4 days. Again, I'm just going to note part of an interesting sort of wave of anti-Russian pushback that has been coming from a bunch of different quarters over the past few weeks. As far as I can tell, I'd love to get somebody on to clarify this for us, maybe next week, because we're going into a weekend. But I'd love to clarify. As far as I can tell, though, this doesn't sort of change any pre-existing laws. It just implements in the Constitution some things that people don't like, including myself, about banning, again, same-sex marriage and adoption. But it's not like it turned something back. I might be wrong about that, but that's what I've read and heard so far. And with that, you're all caught up. That is the news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Man, those headlines went on for a long time. I'm sorry, that was like 8 straight minutes of talking, and now I need a breath.
You're fine. I think you got, for whatever reason, You seem to have a little nervousness around the Russian story. Yeah, look, I have no feelings about it. It's not my country. But I would point that out if that was taking place anywhere. And so it's no different to me whether that's taking place there or whether that's taking place here. I would have issues with it. There is a story I do want to talk about, though, the Cozy Bear stuff. Look, let's be honest. Let's be very, very honest. We have a CIA. We have an intelligence service. That intelligence service has a ghastly, ghastly record of doing things around the world, including assassinations, including bombings, and including basically removing certain leaders and putting in dictators. All with the president having this kind of tacit approval of it, even if it doesn't entirely know what they're doing. Meaning at one point, the CIA was just operating kind of on its own steam. The president didn't necessarily need to have its fingers in the organization. That was the purpose of it, right? The president, you don't want him to be held responsible for something ghastly that takes place. You need to have some level of a Section 31, this kind of secondary factor that does things that are grisly, that people will frown at, but that ultimately you believe in your country needs to get done for whatever reason. The very fact that the CIA exists gets across that this is taking place of influence in other countries. All powers, every last one, it try to influence in order to get the things that they think are in the best interest of their country. That is not unique to Russia. That is not unique to the United States. What becomes a problem is when stories like this come out that put out and point the finger at Russia. The problem is that you've pointed the finger at Russia for the last 3 years with one plank after the next, finding itself to be false. Even this last story that came out about the whole Bounty Gate stuff. People remember the Bounty Gate stuff. They don't remember the fact that nobody could substantiate it and that the story wasn't even that credible. And so it's like now you have this news story that comes out that basically says they're trying to influence elections. Here's the catch. When the CIA was trying to involve itself, I believe it was in Chile, and they murdered the general that they could not necessarily influence to back the coup. Well, is that influencing a government or not? And is that the same thing and the same scale of whatever influence you're trying to assume or to assert that Russia is doing? Also, beyond that point, does the CIA have the ability to spoof information? And the answer is, of course, yes. All of these countries, to some degree, have the ability to spoof other systems. So, I don't know. I guess I hear stories like this, and my first thought is, A, I disbelieve it until something comes out to substantiate it. B, even if it is true, I don't necessarily care because I assume that all countries try to have some level of influence and trying to turn a spotlight on one without necessarily the context that all of the other ones are doing the same thing is problematic at the least because it's just dishonest on its face. It gives the public a way of looking at it as if through a skewed lens. But I go back to my default. Until there's something else that substantiates this, the other stories about Trump and Russia has been found to be folly. Even what they're talking about Roger Stone right now, where they're still screaming that Roger Stone was some kind of link between Russia and Trump. This stuff was nonsense. He got convicted of not being a link. And yet Adam Schiff will come out and say and assert the opposite of that. It makes me distrust these type of stories. And so on its face, it's like, yeah, I don't believe it. And honestly, even if it is true, are you trying to tell me that the whole purpose of the CIA is not to do the exact same thing? I mean, it's a little bit of both. Ultimately, I end up not caring. It's the government's job to prevent those things from happening. It's also, and honestly, even though it's unacknowledged, it's the government's job to do exactly the same thing. And maybe in a better world, that wouldn't be true, but this is our world. This is what we have.
I hear you. All right, you know what? We're going to go into a break. We're going to be coming back in just a minute, taking calls 202-521-1320. Again, the number to call is 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Be back in just a minute.
Fault Lines.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Tune in every Friday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for a weekly segment of the worst
most mainstream media headlines of the week. They tell us what's behind the worst, most misleading, and funniest headlines from around the news with Steve Pat of the blog Left Eye on the News. Together, they pull apart the corporate media's bias, spin, and downright lies. Tune in this Friday and every Friday for the worst and most misleading headlines of the week.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening again to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Quick sort of programming note telling people where you can listen to us. If you're in Washington, D.C., you can hear us there on the air. We're on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. In the middle of the country, if you're in Kansas City or thereabouts in that region, locally, you can listen to us 102.9 and 104.7 FM, also 1140 AM. And then if you're online, if it's like most of us are, like practically everybody is. If you're listening to this, I'm guessing at least at some point you're online. When you are, you should be spending all of your time, literally 100% of it, listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan or Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan for that matter, going back over old episodes. Anyway, here's where you can find us. Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music. You can also watch us on YouTube. You can do a quick search for Fault Lines Radio. You can see a graphic. You can listen to us there. But you can watch Jamarl and occasionally my disembodied head over on his channel. If you do a search for Jamarl Thomas, you'll see he has live video and audio going up. You can also listen to us over on Periscope. No video there, sadly, due to, again, being out of the studio and complications with tech. But you can listen to us on Periscope over on Twitter. Just go to twitter.com/faultlinesradio, just like that. Man, and with that out of the way, again, we're taking calls this segment, 202-521-1320. Currently, the boards are open. If anybody feels like calling in, please do. And you know what? This is going to come out of nowhere, but Brian Baker is a good guy. He seems like a good dude. And the reason I'm saying that, of course, you know why, Jamarl Thomas. You just sent me a message saying I like Brian Becker, and I do too. Anyway, that felt like as appropriate a transition into the segment as any I could give, throwing a complete non sequitur out there from my end too. Maybe we can get back into the story about Russia, CrowdStrike and stuff. Oh, you know what? They'll actually come back on this. He said I was nervous about this story with
It sounded like it. That's all. It just sounded like it. It sounded like there was a lot of words that was used to kind of put a soft landing around it. That's all.
Yeah.
That's all.
No, I do that all the time. That's definitely a bad habit. People close to me and far from me know sometimes I do that. Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things. I don't fully understand it. And we talk about Hong Kong and how the U.S. is kind of doing its overreach thing in Hong Kong. As far as I can tell, the MO for the U.S. doing any overreach is we look at other countries that we say are denying their citizens civil liberties in some way, and then we go in and invade them, either literally with our military or more metaphorically or figuratively with, supporting NGOs that are dissident in the country, that kind of thing. Like these softer coups, however you want to put that. It can sometimes turn into hard coups too. So I see this story coming out, and I did a quick search based on, what you put in there. I see this story coming out, and I see a bunch of people talking about it in the last couple of days. They weren't talking about it towards the middle of the month. They started to talk about it after this wave of anti-Russian stories came out, whether it was the Taliban or within the last day or two, the vaccine and the UK election meddling thing. So I just see these things of a piece, and that might be wrong, but that's sort of the lens that I viewed it through, and that makes me a bit nervous. Now, the other thing that makes me a bit nervous is that, I think that people should have rights, and I think that, people should be able to marry other people no matter what the gender of the person is that they're marrying. That's sort of my American perspective. And so there's a little bit of nervousness there, but it's one of these issues that's just kind of hard to talk about for those reasons. I don't want to promote like what could become the United States really ragging on Russia for what I see as a relatively small problem in terms of, geopolitical significance and the likelihood of nuclear war or all life on Earth being irrevocably changed, that kind of thing.
No, that makes sense. It's the Obama problem. For African Americans, it was the Obama problem. That basically, it's like you're looking at the world from a world's perspective. You're not looking at it specifically from a United States perspective. And from the world's perspective, looking at it from that way, you say, I want less war. And how do I get less war? Great. Now you have a problem of, okay, here's a law that you don't particularly like. However, you know that other governments, especially Western powers, are doing everything that they can to encroach upon the borders and to undermine this other government. And looking at it from a world perspective, what do? How do you deal with that situation when you're stuck with this weird juxtaposition of, yeah, I am in disagreement with this, but the people who are saying something about it are also these people who are just trying to undermine the government in and of itself. This goes with the Obama issue. So Obama gets in office, African Americans, Jesse Jackson is crying on the White House lawn, bawling. And Obama gets in office and he's basically a Republican, right? I mean, like he would tell you himself, he says, yeah, in the 90s, I would have been considered a Republican. He gives 95% of the income gains to the top 1%. He protects Wall Street. He puts through the Heritage Foundation's basically Romney Care all across the United States, where health insurance companies are just, suckling upon the good givings of the government on this case. But Obama was, he was basically a Dino. Now, what do you do with this? The Republicans are attacking him viciously. And some of the things that they're attacking him with are coming across as being racist. And because of that, as an African American, what do? Do you join in with the criticism that is legitimate, or do you reflexively try to protect him because of the attacks that are coming his way? It's not an easy question, right? I mean, it's almost like it's because you're looking at who's attacking him and whether or not those attacks are fair, and they came across as unfair. Even the way that the government itself kind of refused to allow Merrick Garland to get a seat. Like, that's a massive, massive breach of any kind of typical protocol, where the government itself just breaks down because of this notion of gamesmanship of wanting to get ahead in regards to competitive competition that matters more than the government itself working. But it was the same problem. And that problem is not easy one to solve. I mean, it's almost like you have to dance between the raindrops and making a very clear distinction between, I am against this policy. However, I am not on board with these other people who are basically just lumping in to attack them for any random thing. So, no, I feel you. It's not, it's a nuance. I agree.
Another thing here, and Russia's doing better with it. I was just checking these stats. They're doing better than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. But the fertility rate thing, again, this isn't an ethical dimension. This is purely a sort of political economy, practical thing for them as a nation state or whatever. But their fertility rate was famously low during the 2000s, like 1.2 births per couple, which is very, very low. Like lower, for instance, just to give some contrast, lower than Japan's, which is notoriously low. Japan's, as far as I can tell, never went in the past 20, 30 years below like 1.26. So just from the perspective of a country trying to have children so that they can invest in their future, that kind of thing, I can understand that angle too. I'm not sure how much that applies now because, again,
wait. A law is not going to make Susan to all of a sudden want Tommy if Susan was already biologically geared to want another, Beth or something.
Totally. Yeah. No,
I guess I'm saying I don't think the law would do that or encourage that.
I think that they can see where it might. I think that they're trying to sort of, and maybe this is a guess, maybe we should get somebody who's more informed, but I could see them trying to influence culture through embedding this stuff in the Constitution, and that might, in the long run, they might see that as having consequences on the fertility rate. But then again, that might just be a sort of cynical take on it. It might just be completely genuine, and again, their cultural values being embedded in their Constitution.
Yeah, we massively disagree on this one, because I don't know how me saying or making a proclamation, if I was God King Thomas, and I said, all right, from here on out, we need to increase birth rate. And so no more homosexuality. That's not going to stop those people from being gay. I guess that's all I'm saying. If you want to, honestly, if you want to do this, I would say you get a little bit more salacious as a government. Like, you try to find ways to influence people to be a little bit more, I don't know, flirtatious, maybe giving them more time off, maybe giving them a little bit more cash in the bank so they're therefore more comfortable in regards to kind of messing around. I don't know. This just seems, like a conservative, win in that case. It doesn't feel like something that actually legitimately will change how people go about their affairs. I feel you, but I massively disagree with that.
I hear you. And again, I was putting that forward as a potential reason, not one that I would endorse and one that I don't even know that they endorse, just the potential sort of practical consideration they might have. I've heard other people say that. That's the thing. I've heard not even extremely far right, just sort of moderately conservative people talk about the relationship between fertility rates and the permissions of like same-sex marriages or same-sex relationships. Again, I fall pretty squarely on the line of people should be allowed to have those things if they want, and the government should recognize it. But just trying to put all into the conversation.
All right, I know what you mean. So I think the argument is basically, look, if you give people a tacit approval for it, if your society becomes permissive of this particular act, then more people may err towards that side, meaning sexuality is not fixed in absolutes, it's fluid. And if you have a society that is less permissible for it, you might have more people who stay within that realm of fluidity where they don't necessarily mess around like that. I just don't buy that. I mean, ultimately, I think if you pass a law like that, people will still be messing around behind the scenes. It's just like when you're in Muslim countries and you get into these conversations where they're like, yeah, our parents have this idea of this stuff, but we still find ways to do it because at the end of the day, they're human beings. Like I remember I was in Egypt. I was in Dahab. And I am in a computer lab, and this guy's watching porn in the computer lab. Regardless of whatever the religious overlay of the society, the drives of the individual are still the drives of the individual. And I don't necessarily think the law is going to do it. But I grant, I see where you're coming from with the argument.
But also, I mean, here's the thing. We were having a conversation. I thought you were on the opposite side of this conversation earlier, that like social changes, institutional changes, et cetera, even legal changes can have significant ramifications on people's opinions. You know what I mean?
But they can. So I just don't think this does, because I don't think this affects sexuality, something that I think is just ingrained. Like if I'm trying to change your point of view on, let's say, cats. I don't know. You have a country that, for whatever reason, needs to all of a sudden have reverence for cats because the alien civilization is going to destroy the world without it. Well, I can influence your point of view on that over the course of successive generations by passing certain laws or whatever that kind of just makes you like cats a little bit more. But trying to change who you like and who you love and whether or not your biological incentives and drives or whatever. I don't think you're going to change your biological drives with issues of law, even though you may make something more or less permissible by that law, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with you. And again, I fell on the opposite side of that argument. I fell on exactly where you're coming down now, because this has to do with human nature on that deeper level. So I agree with you. I'm saying from the perspectives of people setting policies, trying to change the course of a country on this high level, I could see them trying to turn a lever like this. Yeah. But we sort of went off into this tangent because I brought it up. It's a little bit interesting, but I don't want to read too much into this. Again, as far as I can tell, this is mainly just a cultural thing.
I love the conversation, right? It is fault lines. And I have heard conservatives kind of make that type of argument for that stuff. So it's just the conversation, right? There is something I do want to talk about before we end it, though. The number of deaths are increasing. So the New York Times has come out with a story that basically is saying, for the longest time, Donald Trump kept saying, hey, look at the deaths. The deaths haven't been going up. And I've been pointing out on this channel, or let's say we've been pointing out on this channel, that on one day, I think yesterday you had like 1,000 deaths. On the day before that, you had like 935. Like, you're seeing deaths go up. You're seeing ICUs starting to fill up. You're seeing hospitals starting to fill up. And that has nothing to do with testing. Now, the lag time between it being revealed in this case expanded because basically you've gotten better at treating the illness. You've started to learn more just through the scientific method of hypothesis and testing that hypothesis and getting an answer about a yay or nay, and both yay and nay gets you to different information or outcome in regards to your knowledge about this particular illness. And so your time frame between seeing the deaths expand just kind of expanded a bit. But at this point, you've started to see them tick up. And like you said, Shane, we're getting to that Fauci point of like 100,000, 200,000 deaths a day. And just from probability alone.
Infections, real quick. Infections per day, not deaths.
Infections per day. You're right. Infections per day.
That would be the end
the deaths per day. That would be monstrous. Yeah, that would be monstrous. Yeah. But yeah, the number of infections per day. And just by definition, the probability of that is going to increase the number of deaths that you have associated with it. Not to mention, if your hospitals start to get overwhelmed, and your hospitals get to the point where you can't tolerate the number of people that are coming in. I mean, Florida was at like 85%, no, Georgia was like 85% capacity. So this looks like it's getting bad. And this is entirely from leadership, or you can say lack thereof.
And it has looked like it's been getting bad for months. And partly, I think what's confusing people is the last couple of months, like there's this question of whether it looks like it might be getting bad slower than we were expecting. With, what was first called the second wave was later reframed as like the extension of the first wave, this sort of resurgence in cases, where there was a bit of a lull in between there as social distancing and masks and stuff in reducing the numbers in some states. Now we've seen this resurgence, and the question remains, what the heck is going to come next? I don't know. I mean, it seems like we're headed, unless something really drastic happens now or last week, it seems like we're headed towards the 100,000 new infections a day grim milestone marker thing coming up. And then the question, of course, becomes, what about the deaths? We've seen, like we were just reporting in the headlines, in Florida, a record-breaking day for deaths, 150 new deaths. On the other hand, we're still nowhere near, around under 1,000 deaths per day total in the United States. We've been there for a while, sometimes significantly under that count. The peak was like 2,500 deaths per day, and it's still this question of how far is that lagging going to lag? You know what I mean? Anyway, we've got to go into a break. We're going to be joined on the other side of this break by Stephanie Kelton talking about modern monetary theory and her book. I know you're excited about this, Jamarl. We'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my disembodied co-host right here, Shane Stranahan. We're coming to you live out of Washington, D.C. If you guys are in the area, you can listen to us on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. You can also catch us in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, you can, whatever platform you listen to us, give us a like, share the content. You can also get involved in the conversation by sending a chat, a tweet, and of course, a phone call, 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Coming up is a person I have been trying to get for a while now, and I am so appreciative that she's coming on to the show. We're being joined by Stephanie Kelton. And Stephanie Kelton is an author and leading authority on modern monetary theory. Her book, The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy, shows how to break free of the flawed thinking that has hamstrung policymakers around the world. Stephanie Kelton, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
Absolutely. I guess the first question, the basic question, just for people who don't necessarily know what monetary theory is, basically when Nixon pulled us out of gold standard, we became a fiat currency. That means it's not backed by anything. It's just a belief structure. And what matters more is basically the resources that your government has and not necessarily the deficit in this case. The deficit is more so a tool in order to ensure that your country can do what it needs to do, whether that's healthcare, whether that's education, whether that's full employment. Am I explaining that correctly? And please add in what I'm missing on this.
Well, you're right to say that something very important happened when President Nixon took the U.S. off of basically the gold standard. It was an international monetary system known as the Bretton Woods system. I'm not going to get into a lot of details, but what's important is that under that system, the U.S. pledged to convert its currency, the U.S. dollar, into gold at a fixed price. This was internationally convertible. So anyway, when you have a monetary system like that, you're right. It's not a floating exchange rate. It's a form of fixed exchange rate. It tethers your currency to something that's finite, your gold reserves. And it makes you run your macroeconomic policy more cautiously because you have to be careful about how many dollars you're putting out there because those dollars are potentially convertible into gold, which you can run out of. So once you leave that monetary system and you move to what we have today, the U.S. dollar is untethered from gold. The government doesn't pledge to convert the U.S. dollar into anything. It's a tax receipt, basically. And so the government's only obligation today with respect to its currency is to accept it back from the rest of us in payment of obligations we have to the government, mostly tax obligations. So that opens up some policy space. It gives the government a new degree of freedom to run its macroeconomic policy less, I don't want to say less cautiously, but more ambitiously, better in the interest of its population without the need to worry about running out of gold reserves. So it adds flexibility. And the main point really is that we haven't fully come to terms. We haven't really reckoned with what it means to have a government that is the issuer of a non-convertible fiat currency. And we haven't been taking full advantage of this system that we have today in the ways that we could be taking advantage to build a better economy.
What would be the ways we could take advantage of this to build a better economy? Like, explain that. You said we're not necessarily coming to terms with it. What does it mean to come to terms with it as a country, to deal with basically in control of your own currency and having a fiat currency at that?
Well, one of the things it means is that you don't have to live in fear. Okay, when you're on a gold standard, you kind of live in fear of running your policy in ways that has the rest of the world taking your gold reserves, and you're running out of your gold reserves, and it undermines your entire monetary arrangement. We don't have to live in fear of that, but we still have been living in fear. We've been living in fear of budget deficits, of running a deficit, of increasing this thing we call the national debt. We live in fear of, China and other foreign lenders believing that, if we don't run our macroeconomic policy to please Wall Street or to please foreign investors, that somehow they're going to turn off the spigot and no more dollars will come pouring out of the faucet. And then we'll be starved of the ability to fund programs that, are important here domestically, to fund economic policy oriented at creating jobs for people, at maintaining our infrastructure, at funding our schools and our healthcare and all those things, because we have this belief or this set of beliefs that all of these bad things are going to happen if we run our macroeconomic policy taking advantage of the currency system we have to build a better economy. We live in fear of all kinds of things that aren't legitimate fears, is what I argue in my new book.
You're arguing basically that the government can spend money for those things, meaning if this country needs healthcare to ensure that each and every person has healthcare, congratulations, it's your birthright. We've evolved as a society to do this. Well, we can supply that, meaning we can pay that bill. If it's a bill of education to ensure that each and every person can go to college, the government can afford to pay that. I think you're arguing that basically because we're the only place where dollars can be made, that the government can spend those dollars to do those programs without it basically sinking our economic system. Am I explaining that correctly? And if so, why aren't the people who scream that, oh my God, the deficit is going to get so large that other countries or something is going to happen to us where we're just going to implode, why are they wrong?
Well, they're wrong for lots of different reasons, and economists put up all kinds of different barriers, theoretical, mathematical, to try to make the case that even if we can afford financially to fund programs, that there are constraints and reasons why we should not be doing it. There are ideas, some of this is high level kind of macroeconomic theory with models and things that look very persuasive and rigorous. It looks like science is telling you can't do these things. And economists, build these, the theoretical frameworks and the models that justify denying the expansion of government spending to support programs of the kind you were just talking about, to say, no, look, even if Congress could approve that spending, it will increase the deficit. And as it increases the deficit, that will push interest rates higher. And as it pushes interest rates higher, that will crowd out or elbow out of the way some other borrowers, especially private businesses, who would have been able to access those funds and borrow for private investment, which would have boosted growth even more, led to more job creation. And so the deficit spending, while we could do it, is actually a bad idea because it will leave us with less private investment and a slower growing, less dynamic economy in the future. It will increase the national debt, which will put the debt on an unsustainable trajectory, which will lead to inflation. This is the kind of stuff that economists will say, even if they concede the point that the government, that Congress can write these bills and pass these bills, they'll still stand there and tell you that there are a whole host of reasons why it would be detrimental in some sense to pursue these policies unless they're so-called paid for, unless you can do these things without increasing the deficit. So if you can raise taxes to offset that spending and avoid adding to the deficit, then maybe, and I stress maybe you can get some economists to agree that it would make sense to put more money into infrastructure or education or something, provided that you can do it without increasing the national debt and pushing deficits up.
Stephanie, this is the voice of Shane. Thank you so much for joining us. I had a quick question here. Yeah, we started it off, I think, on the exact right note. You were talking about the Bretton Woods Agreement that led into the Nixon shock. There are the various stages in the last century when it comes to America's monetary policy. A big thing here, and I'm curious to get your take on this, is the question of the USD being the reserve currency. What's your take on that? Do you think that should continue? Do you see that as irrelevant to what you're thinking about? I mean, I'm asking this just to sort of set it up. It seems to me like the USD being the reserve currency does a bunch of things, but one thing it does is it makes it not just a conversation about America's economy, but about the sort of global monetary policy and the global economy. And again, in a floating exchange rate system with the USD as the reserve currency, I could just see that having some significant ramifications on our ability to enact something like MMT. But what's your take on that?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by enact MMT. So MMT is an economic framework. It's a framework for analysis. So we've already enacted it because it's a description of how the monetary system works, of how government finance works within the context of the current monetary system, the floating exchange rate fiat, what we've been talking about. So MMT's here. We have it. It works. We're describing the system as it exists. You're right to say that the U.S. dollar has a special place in the international system, even though, we don't have the monetary arrangement we had in the up until 1971. The dollar remains a very special currency in the global financial system. And I suspect that it will retain that status for many years to come. Will it last forever? Probably not. Nothing does. A few things last forever. But there are special advantages that come for the U.S. In terms of being the global reserve currency. Most contracts are written globally, right, in U.S. dollar terms. And that means that the U.S. has access to markets. We can essentially buy from the rest of the world anything they're willing to sell to us, and they're willing to sell to us a lot because there's an appetite for the U.S. dollar. A lot of countries are happy to accumulate U.S. dollars in exchange for the things that they manufacture, produce, and sell to us. So it gives us special privileges, if you like. It also gives us some added responsibility in the sense that you got a lot of countries around the world who borrow in U.S. dollars. It's not their currency, but in order to get critical inputs, things that they need for their population, medicine, technology, food, energy, they can't spend their own domestic currency. It's just not widely enough accepted and valued internationally. So they have to offer a currency that is widely accepted, and that very often is the U.S. dollar. So these small, think of a small developing country, right? An African country in Latin America who borrows in U.S. dollars in order to be able to import energy, food, whatever for its population, and now is on the hook. It's in debt in a currency that it can't issue. So that makes it, in a sense, a responsibility of the currency issuer, the U.S., to continue to supply the dollars, to allow these countries to earn the dollars so that they can service their debt obligations and so forth. So you don't have to be the world reserve currency, though, in order to run economic policy the way we started off talking about, to be able to build to have full employment domestically, to fund education, to hire teachers and put kids in classrooms and build hospitals and so forth domestically. You don't need to be the world reserve currency. Japan does it, Australia does it, Canada does it, the UK does it, countries all over Europe do this. So.
Okay, great answer. Thank you for that, Stephanie. Really appreciate that. We're joined by Stephanie Kelton. She is the author of the book, The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy. We'll be back with Stephanie in just a minute to continue this conversation about modern monetary theory. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
It's time to double down with Max and Stacy.
Yeah, double down. We're talking markets, finance, business, economics, ka-ching, bling, just about everything money related on Sputnik. It's called Double Down.
We're asking, are dead cats bouncing or have fundamentals changed? That's this week on Double Down.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back again. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're joined now very happily by Stephanie Kelton. She is an author and a leading authority on modern monetary theory, and her book, The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy, shows how to break free of the flawed thinking that has hamstrung policymakers around the world. Stephanie, thank you again for being with us. I wanted to follow up sort of where we were going with the last conversation. Started to move into a conversation about the reserve currency, the USD's status as the reserve currency, some of the upsides and downsides of that. I think that's important, and maybe we can come back to that if we have time. But I actually want to go back first to the last point you were making before I asked that question. You were talking about some of the common criticisms of MMT, and there were two things that stood out to me, and I want to get just a bit more detailed on how MMT deals with these. There's the issue of interest rates, and then there's the issue of inflation. Just to briefly restate it, and please correct me where I go wrong here, because I'm sure I will. I'm a layperson with this stuff. But with the interest rates, like you're saying, if you have a bunch of money printed out, the sort of neo-Keynesian, neoclassical economic view of things, as far as I can tell, is that if you have too much money printed, that's going to that's going to drive interest rates down. As interest rates get driven further down, that's going to limit the ability of the government to loan money out. That people are not going to be as interested in borrowing money from the government. And that's going to cause problems in the sort of wider economic cycle, the wider economic space, as companies can't get investments they would need to start up new goods and services, companies that would provide new goods and services. Then there's the issue of inflation that would just drive down everybody's purchasing power, as far as I can tell. That's sort of self-evidently a bad thing for a lot of people, especially when you get into the range of something approaching hyperinflation. For the average person, that doesn't look good. I can understand the second one a bit more than the first. But where do you think traditional neoclassical thinking goes wrong on these issues? Where do you think modern monetary theory sees the light or provides more reason than we saw before?
Well, okay, let's do the first one, because I think you did get that. Either you're conflating monetary and fiscal policy, or I think you have it backwards. So let me kind of take that one on, the interest rate piece. When you say printing money, MMPers never use the phrase printing money. That we just avoid that because it's imprecise, and it doesn't make it clear whether we're talking about something the central bank is doing or something that Congress is doing, right? If we're talking about fiscal policy. So the basic thinking in conventional mainstream economic theory is that monetary policy, that's something that's done by the central bank. So in the U.S., think of the Fed. If the Fed is quote unquote printing money, let's just use the term, the Fed is increasing the money supply. That drives interest rates down. So you're right. There's this belief that interest rates go down. But the reason the central bank would do that is that it's trying to actually stimulate economic activity, that by pushing interest rates down, it's making credit very cheap. And that is supposed to lead people to borrow more, not less. It doesn't make it harder.
I got that wrong. I got that reversed.
So you push the interest rate down and everybody goes, woohoo, interest rates are down. It's so cheap to borrow money now. Let's run out and buy a house, buy a car, borrow to expand my small business or my larger business or whatever. So that increases borrowing and spending, which then potentially carries inflation risk, because if interest rates go too low for too long, the belief is that you can engineer conditions, you can lay the groundwork for like a big expansion that leads to too many people finding jobs, an economy that starts to run too hot, and then some inflationary pressure. So then at that point, the central bank does what? Well, they reverse things. They raise interest rates to try to choke off the borrowing and spending and slow the economy down. So that's the conventional way of thinking about it through monetary policy. But there's also a way to think about it through fiscal policy, which is to say, and this would work differently, the more like you were talking about. This would be Congress authorizing lots of additional spending. That spending enters the economy as newly created dollars. So there is your new money creation. And as people get that, those new dollars, it stimulates activity. It becomes income to someone. They go out and, spend it. And then you can potentially create inflationary pressures that way. The difference is that conventional economics believes that increasing deficit spending forces the government into competition with the private sector, so that the government has to, quote, finance its deficit by borrowing. And the borrowing the government is doing drives the interest rate up, you see. So that's where interest rates go up. And now you have this tension between rising interest rates pushing private borrowing down and the government's own spending having some, positive impact on economic activity.
Very interesting. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Thank you for that explanation. That does make sense. But that does get to a kind of an interesting point. MMT is basically, at its root, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's basically saying, look, the cash isn't real. This is almost like just kind of an accounting of sorts. That, it's unconscionable to basically allow human beings who need things to go without those things under something that basically we create out of thin air. MMT seems to be just more brazen about that assessment. Is there any amount where it becomes too much? Like, for example, is there anything that the government in this case can't do from the standpoint of the model that MMT creates? And I understand, like, we're using it now. Basically, to fund our military. We're $20 trillion in debt. And so we're using it to fund all of these programs as is. But does that number get too high, or at a point where we can't bear the number itself? I guess I'm trying to get to the root of where MMT, the limits, the boundaries of this idea of things, or this view of monetary theory.
Yeah, that's at the core of MMT. I think more so than any other macroeconomic approach, all these schools of thought in economics, in macroeconomics. You have Keynesians and new Keynesians and classical and new classical and real business cycle and Austrians and the Marxists and the Institute. So we got all these schools of thought. MMT is one of many macroeconomic approaches. And I think more than any of the others, we center inflation at, the center. I mean, it's at the center of the analysis. It is the relevant constraint. It is the limit. So when you say, this is how you characterize it, the monetary system is essentially, just digits, right? It's just numbers that we place on balance sheets. You can think of the economy and even the global economy as just a series of interlocking balance sheets. Think of it as one huge Excel spreadsheet. And the currency issuer has special powers to make debits and credits, to change the numbers on the spreadsheet. So the federal government, the U.S. government, can go in and change the numbers on the spreadsheet. They can put numbers onto my account. Look, Congress has done this, right? Those $1,200 checks that went out as part of the CARES Act, the so-called, the stimulus, right, to deal with the pandemic and the economic fallout, the government sent most Americans $1,200 check. Okay, that changed the numbers in a lot of people's bank accounts up by $1,200. Okay, how did they do that? Well, they're the currency issuer. So they made a commitment to add $1,200 to people's accounts. And they're going to do something here, I suppose, in the next 8 or so days. And there will be another round of payments and another big piece of legislation, and more entries will be made. They always have the capacity to do that. And they can also debit our accounts. Okay? When we pay our taxes, they're changing the numbers down in accounts. So you're asking, could we solve real problems? Could we address the real deficits in our economy, in healthcare, in education, in our infrastructure, with climate? Could we use the monetary system? Could we operationalize it more effectively to make payments, to pay people to do the work in the classrooms, in the hospitals, in the community, to improve lives? That's really, I think, at root what you're asking. The answer is absolutely. Yes, we could do that.
That sounds.
Limit. I'm sorry. Can I say something about the limit? Because that was your question, and that's what's important. So here the government has this important power to change the numbers in the spreadsheet. And so you say, wow, that sounds great. Why don't we fix everything all at once? And just, why can't everyone have $1 million in their account? Well, the answer is that if you put $1 million into my account, I'm going to want to have lots of things really quickly. Like, these two cars we drive, they're pretty old. Let's get a couple of new cars. I could think, let's get a pool. Let's get this. And I would start spending. And all of a sudden, everybody's got $1 million, and we're all trying to spend into an economy that can't produce enough goods and services. We just don't have the people and the machines and the factories to satisfy that much demand all at once. So we would overwhelm the system, and the punishment for that would be inflation. And I suspect it would be massive. Like, we would really drive inflation up by delivering $1 million to everyone. You can't do that. What you can do is, prioritize and budget your nation's real resources. You can look around and say, wow, when it's safe to do so, we're going to have tens of millions of Americans out of work who can be immediately hired and reemployed, and the federal government can play a role there in directly creating employment for people on the other side of this pandemic, for people whose jobs have been lost for good. We can reemploy them, and we can put them to work building a care economy. We can take care of people in our communities and our planet. There's more than enough work to do. We can build hospitals. We can, fund schools. We can do those things, provided that we have the nurses and the doctors and the educators. And it's the real resource constraint. That's what matters. If you try to buy things that aren't available for sale, you just bid up prices. So the limit is your economy's real productive capacity.
So one quick question here, and this is just something that immediately strikes me as interesting, but I also think it cuts to the core of this issue and in some of the disagreements between MMT and other preceding economic policies or agendas or just ideas. A few things I could go with here, but we only have a few minutes left. Here's where I'll go. It sounds like you're saying that it would be through a process of sort of selected, a little bit more cautious investments that we can get out of the mess we've got ourselves into with our economic policy, specifically with our fiscal policy. Maybe actually the MMT wouldn't see it as such a mess as a lot of people do, because again, if the deficit isn't quite as big of a deal, if we can beat that in some way, I'm curious to get to that, but we only have a minute. Here's where I'm going to go with this. How can we tell what the sort of real productive capacity, what the real resources are in our economy, if not by their value through our monetary system? In other words, my perspective on this is, don't we use money right now to determine the sort of scarcity and availability of things? And then how could we get around that? What other more valuable or more accurate metric would we use with this if we're undergoing this process of sort of evaluating for ourselves as a country, as a state, what's valuable, what amounts of resources we have available, that whole issue. Hopefully that makes sense. What's your take on that, Stephanie?
Well, it depends what you're trying to accomplish. So if we said, I'm just going to give you a quick example. If we said we want to repair and rebuild America's crumbling infrastructure, both parties talk about this. This is one of those areas where there's usually wide bipartisan support, infrastructure investment. Let's say that Democrats and Republicans got together and said, we are committed to tackling our infrastructure deficit. We want to spend $2 or $3 trillion over the next 4 years modernizing, building resilient infrastructure, so forth. And they make that commitment. The question is, has anybody stopped to think about whether we have the real resources to carry out a large-scale, ambitious infrastructure investment program over the next 3 or 4 years? So what would you need? You got to look out there and say, do we have the construction workers that it's going to take to do this? Do we have architects, engineers? Are we going to have the steel and the heavy machinery? Are we going to be able to call up Caterpillar and place a huge order and get the cranes and the, machines that pour concrete and move stuff around and all that kind of? You see what I'm saying?
I do. We've got to cut it there. Stephanie, thank you so much. That actually is a great answer. You've just got to sort of do it directly. I think there's a lot more to talk about there. Hopefully we can get you back on soon. Sorry to cut it short, but for everybody who's been listening, you've been listening to Stephanie Kelton, author, leading authority, and author specifically of the book, The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be back on Monday. Have a great weekend, folks.
Guys, as always, thank you for joining us for the show. Stephanie Kelton is an amazing get. Shout out to our producer on that one. I've wanted her to come on my show for a very, very long time. And so having her to be able to come on today is just awesome. I was hyped up like nobody's business for this particular show. So I will leave it here, though. Like, share, subscribe, and I will see you guys later today. Thanks all. Bye-bye.